Chapter 1229 Collective Wisdom. Seeing that Miss Magician had yet to react, Klein made the world add, "You don't need to be there. Just summon my historical projection in advance." "All right." Furs nodded hurriedly. At that moment, because Gehrman Sparrow had accepted his mission, Emlyn clearly relaxed. From what he knew, this meant that the success rate of the matter had skyrocketed. In the next second, the world looked at him and hoarsely asked, "What kind of payment can you provide?" Emlyn fell silent for 2 seconds before saying with his eyes dotting upwards slightly, "Once I become a Shaman King, I'll provide a free promise on similar matters. Also, I only want the Shaman King's Beyonder characteristic. The members of the Rose School of Thought Temperance faction should have a clear goal. The rest will be yours." Mr. Moon isn't very stolid. He doesn't have much confidence. Through his actions and words, Audrey came to a conclusion. This fellow Emlyn has learned how to use consumption loans. Klein secretly laughed and made the world indifferently reply, "It looks like you can only afford a demigod like me. If Mr. Moon can provide a large amount of food, I don't mind participating." Justice Audrey mumbled inwardly. However, she didn't need to say anything to know what Mr. Moon would say. Why would we Sanguine be hoarding so many snacks? To the Sanguine, their staple was the blood of humans with abundant spirituality. Bread and meat products were all non-essentials. Seeing that the world Gehrman Sparrow didn't reject his offer, Emlyn secretly heaved a sigh of relief. "What other requests do you have? I'll try my best to fulfill them." Gehrman Sparrow thought for a moment before saying, "Give me a mystical item or a sealed artifact that can greatly increase the wielder's spirituality for a short period of time." This was for Miss Magician, allowing her to maintain the historical void projection for a few more minutes. And there was no doubt that the Moon Domain had such Beyonder powers. For example, the Scarlet Scholar could create a full moon state, allowing their spirituality to be enhanced. Phew. Emlyn quickly nodded. "All right, no problem." Seeing that the human and vampire had come to an agreement, Furs hurriedly raised her hand and said, "No full moon." That way, ignoring the enhancement of her spirituality, she would be considered lucky if she didn't die on the spot. After all, the higher the sequence, the clearer one could hear Mr. Door's ravings. Furs had long since advanced from Sequence 6 Scribe to Sequence 5 Traveler. Emlyn also knew about Miss Magician's full moon curse, so he had no questions about it. He acknowledged tersely, indicating that he had taken note. At this moment, Alger, who was listening to the completed transaction beside him, said in thought, "Although the Beyonders of the Rose School of Thought are easily controlled by their emotions and instincts, this didn't mean that their brains had already disappeared along with their zombification. Even if they're gone, they still have members of the Moon Domain. Since their demigods were directly involved in the Southern Continent's war and have exposed their locations, they wouldn't dismiss the possibility of an attack from the Sanguine and Temperance faction. I believe there's a high chance of them laying a trap." "That's right," Leonard echoed. "Many dossiers indicate that, although the Beyonders of the Rose School of Thought are well known for indulging themselves in bloodshed, cruelty and desires, they still act very meticulously. Their actions show certain cunningness and sinisterness." Zio glanced at her friend and said, "I encountered a supernatural incident involving the Rose School of Thought 2 months ago. The target was obviously deceived and fell into a trap." The world Gehrman Sparrow listened attentively before scoffing. He then said to Emlyn, "Which Shaman King is your target?" Emlyn didn't hide anything. The Shaman King who led the natives from East Balam's Northolite County to attack the Lone's main colonial city. Upon hearing this, a thought flashed across Klein's mind. The Mother Tree of Desire doesn't seem to want the goddess to control the uniqueness of the death pathway. She was driving the natives and using the war to waver the fundamental faith of the Church of Evernight in the southern continent. As this thought flashed through his mind, he made the world Gehrman Sparrow look at Emlyn and chuckle. "Then my target will be another Shaman King. This has nothing to do with your operation." There was no need for him to be too direct. Emlyn, Katlia, and company quickly understood his plan. This was a simple plan. Gehrman Sparrow hunted another Shaman King and took the initiative to step into a trap to attract the hidden forces of the Rose School of Thought. And at that moment, the Moon and the Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction would take the opportunity to attack the real target. "Isn't this too dangerous?" Emlyn subconsciously replied. The danger was of course directed to Gehrman Sparrow, who would be walking into a trap. The world Gehrman Sparrow replied very calmly, "It will just be a historical projection. If he dies, so be it." Upon hearing such an answer, Emlyn, Leonard, and the other members of the Tarot Club were at a loss as to what expression to show as a response. It was unknown if they should reflect on the fact that Sequence 3 demigods were different, or be envious that scholars of yore had such beyonder powers. Klein continued to let the world speak. If the Rose School of Thought has any doubts about my sudden attack, and only divert a portion of their strength to stop me so as to still maintain a relatively complete trap, then I will try to hunt that Shaman King seriously and turn the false target into the true target. After all you want is the corresponding items. You don't care who the original owner is. A simple but effective plan. The key point is that Gehrman Sparrow has to have a strength that exceeds his limits, one that can put up resistance even when facing an angel. Audrey learned from him seriously and evaluated this inwardly. Emlyn no longer had any doubts. After some thought, he said, before the official operation, I need to meet with the members of the Rose School of Thought Temperance faction to finalize the details. The World Gehrman Sparrow nodded and said, make arrangements for it. After the exchange, Klein made the World Conjure a paper stack and distributed it to the members of the Tarot Club. Some existences and I will be dealing with a mythical creature. You can raise your opinion and share your thoughts. The piece of paper was written with the character and actions of the dark demonic wolf, Kotor, as well as the various analysis Miss Justice had made. He hoped that he could find inspiration through different people with their different personalities and knowledge. Mythical creature. The world has set his sights on mythical creatures? Alger, who had been much quieter than usual, couldn't help but look at the bottom end of the long bronze table. Although he was already mentally prepared for this, he felt that he wouldn't be surprised even if the World Gehrman Sparrow suddenly called himself an angel. However, when he realized that the other party was really targeting a mythical creature, he couldn't help but feel a little shocked and perturbed. Katlia had similar feelings as well, but she immediately recalled the Snake of Fate, the Death Consul, and the Ancient Bane. This matched the Gehrman Sparrow's words of some existences. It was very normal for 3 angels and a Sequence 3 blessed to hunt a mythical creature. One by one, they retracted their gazes from the bottom end of the long mottled table, and they began reading the information in their hands seriously. At this moment, as they weren't involved in the commission or involved in a transaction, nor were they sharing information. Yet, the members of the Tarot Club had a baffling feeling of working together for one common goal. They felt like they were starting to feel like an organization. After reading the contents, Alger was the first to speak. According to Miss Justice's analysis, no bait will trap that paranoid mythical creature. It will only push him to escape further. Under the situation of him suspected to wield a Sequence 1 beyond a characteristic, he really doesn't need to chase after other things. Advancing himself is the most important thing at hand. If you want to deal with him, we can only consider it from this point of view. Upon hearing this, Zio said from a professional point of view, but this mythical creature is very cautious. He doesn't leave any clues behind. And according to the intel, the location he can use to prepare for the Sequence 1 ritual isn't actually restricted in an environment like the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Yes, there are too many monsters for him to use. Derek confirmed what Miss Judgment had said. There was silence immediately. Leonard thought for a moment and said, can we rely on the law of beyonder characteristics convergence? As he spoke, he looked at Klein Moretti. That mythical creature seems to be from the same pathway as you. Just relying on the effect that comes from the convergence of beyonder characteristic at this level to chance upon this mythical creature might take a year or 2, perhaps even longer. Furthermore, the other party is a complete mythical creature. He has the ability to cause some interference. Klein overruled Leonard's suggestion. Of course, if he augmented the power of Sapphira Castle onto himself, he might be able to meet the dark demonic wolf the next time he used the Staff of the Stars' random teleportation. However, the problem was that if that happened, the chances of a coincidental encounter with Amon would be much, much higher. This was the standard way of knocking on death's door. After hearing everyone's discussion, Katlia said in thought according to what the Queen found taboo, can we use this mythical creature's honorific name to establish a connection? If the dark demonic wolf hadn't been tracked by Amon in the past, that might have been possible. But now, what can be thought must have been thought of by Amon. Under such circumstances, the fact that the dark demonic wolf hasn't perished implies that he is wary of such matters. The World Gehrman Sparrow slowly shook his head. With his paranoid character, he definitely wouldn't respond automatically. Just as he said that, he suddenly had an idea. Not receiving a response from the dark demonic wolf didn't mean that he wouldn't pay attention to the corresponding prayer light. Chapter 12:30 Meeting again. As he had personal experience, Klein placed himself in the shoes of the dark demonic wolf and pondered. Usually, he would shut down the automatic prayer response to prevent an enemy from using the feedback to establish a connection and lock onto his position. Under this premise, to receive a sudden prayer from a stranger would no doubt lead to him relying on the corresponding point of light to observe the supplicant and grasp more information. This allowed him to make preparations for what might happen in the future. If the person chanting the honorific name was a powerful existence like Amon or someone relatively more familiar, it would be best to destroy that point of light immediately. However, if the person was a stranger, under such a situation where he was completely safe, he would monitor him for a long period of time to understand the exact situation and see if there was a need for a counterattack. It was something that every rational creature would most likely do. At the very least, Klein would do so. The essence of this matter was that non-mythical creatures were marked by high-level existences. They could die in a baffling and tragic manner at any moment. To the supplicant, this was equivalent to suicide or something even more terrifying. To the dark demonic wolf, it was only a positive outcome, nothing negative. At the beginning, the suspicious dark demonic wolf would definitely suspect that there was a conspiracy. He wouldn't dare to establish a connection and influence Klein from a distance. However, with the passage of time, as the observations deepened and a confirmation was made that the other party was a non-angel weakling who possessed the aura of Sapphira Castle with signs of being unprepared, he would definitely find an opportunity to attack from afar. At the time when Klein was most unprepared, he would mock the prayer light and deal a remote attack. This aligned with Klein's previous conclusion about his advantage that I'm very weak. The only problem with this plan was that the initiative was completely in the hands of the dark demonic wolf. Everything Klein did would be monitored, and there was no way to prepare ahead of time. Once the other party tried to exert his influence on him, he would not be able to fight back and wouldn't be spared. By doing so, I would successfully bait the prey, but kill the hunter as a result. It's meaningless. Yet, if I don't place myself in such a passive position, it will be difficult to bait an angel of the seer pathway, the paranoid demonic wolf. This is something that a marionette or others cannot do in my stead. If only I can be certain that the dark demonic wolf wouldn't rashly attack remotely because of his paranoia and will only choose to monitor and observe. Thoughts raced through Klein's mind as he sought out the possibilities amongst numerous impossibilities. With regards to this, he could only sigh inwardly, feeling regretful for not being an angel from the spectator pathway. According to his assumptions, the angels of the spectator pathway would more or less have some special characteristics of the more others know about you, the more you understand them. When the dark demonic wolf monitored him closely through prayer light and ended up carefully observing an angel from the spectator pathway, his position would undoubtedly be exposed to the other party. Unfortunately, I'm not. Besides, the spectator pathway sequence 2 might not be able to do so. I can only be certain that a sequence 1 has this special trait. Summoning 0-08 from the fog of history? No, let's not talk about whether I can summon that quill without Grozel's travels. Even if I successfully create a projection, the quill is a quill while I am still myself. The dark demonic wolf's understanding of me doesn't make 0-08 do the reverse. Also, I can only use it for a mere 2 minutes. It wouldn't be enough to sense anything. It can be used as supplementary to the plan, writing the development I wish to see happen, making the dark demonic wolf's choice appear reasonable so as to eliminate uncertain elements. Klein considered for a long while, but he failed to find a suitable plan to bait his prey. Apart from feeling regretful that he wasn't a sequence 1 angel of the spectator pathway, he had also thought of the cosmos. Just learning of it would result in corruption from the cosmos. If I had the nature of the cosmos, then after the dark demonic wolf uses the prayer point of light to monitor me, he would be corrupted, allowing me to lock onto his position. However, the cosmos's nature is higher than that of an angel. How could I have it? I keep feeling like I've forgotten something. Klein made the world Gehrman Sparrow shake his head indiscernibly as he surveyed the area. There's no need to discuss the answer now. You can go back and communicate with the right person with suitable methods. He focused his attention on the star Leonard and the hermit Katlia, hoping that they would be able to get advice from the existences that were more experienced such as Pallas Zoroast and Queen Mystic Bernadette. As for himself, he would return to Backlund with the aid of the historical projection. He would seek advice from Miss Messenger, Willa Septon, and the ascetic, Ariana. This is what it means to seek the opinions of angels or quasi-angels before making a major decision. Klein made a self-deprecatory comment. When Leonard and Katlia heard that, They nodded in unison. All right. Following that, the members of the Tarot Club began discussing the situations of the various battlefields until the end of the gathering. After returning to the real world, Leonard, who was resting in St. Samuel Cathedral's basement, spoke in a low voice, explaining all the questions that Klein had posed to him and said, "Old man, do you have any suggestions?" This is him trying to obtain the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic left behind in the forsaken land of the gods. Pallas Zoroast was first enlightened before he chuckled. Tell your former colleague that there's no way he can resolve this matter himself. I only have one suggestion. That is to seek help from the fool. Leonard knew Old Man's character very well. He hurriedly asked, "Is this really the only suggestion?" Pallas Zoroast harumphed and said, "That's a mythical creature that even Amon can't capture. It's possible only by relying on the fool's help." Only then did Leonard nod and sigh. It seems that's the only way. 2 days later, 2 minutes before the meeting time that the Moon Emlyn had agreed to meet Marek. Furs sat on a reclining chair beside the fireplace and listened to the commotion on the second floor. She cast her gaze at her friend, Zio. If the war continues, Backlund will definitely suffer more attacks. Are you really not going to evacuate your mother and brother to the surrounding villages? Zio's short, light blonde hair was parted in an asymmetrical fashion and was neatly combed. Compared to last year, she looked more serious and had the bearing of an adjudicator. She was like a high-ranking knight leading an order of knights. She hesitantly said, "The population in the surrounding villages has reached its limit. Besides, I can still get enough food from Mi9 now." Having said that, she paused and said, "If the flames of war really reach Backlund, take them traveling to Intis and Fainapotter. It seems that's the only way." Just as Furs was about to mention the matter of her buying food in Intis a few days ago, she suddenly heard the alarm ring. She shivered and suddenly sat up straight. She stretched out her right hand, which was wearing a red string, and grabbed into the air. Her arm sank as she pulled out Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a silk top hat and a black trench coat without glasses. The cold adventurer's eyes rolled and gained consciousness, reducing the amount of spirituality that Miss Magician had to expend. He nodded gently as he made the glove on his left hand become transparent. In less than a second, Gehrman Sparrow teleported away and disappeared from Furs and Zio's rented apartment. Furs was stunned for a moment before the corners of her mouth twitched slightly. She turned to Zio and said, "I think I'm just a tool." The sky was already dark, but the street lamps weren't lit up. Only the crimson moon illuminated the entire city. When Klein arrived at the agreed-upon place, he looked around and saw the unusually cold streets, the burning marks on the walls, and the collapsed buildings not far away for a few seconds. Just based on what he saw, Backlund was desolate and dilapidated. It even had the smell of gunpowder wafting through the city. At this moment, Emlyn White walked out of an alley and nodded at the crazy adventurer. According to Gehrman Sparrow's instructions, he didn't say a word or bow. To prevent any delay in whatever precious time Gehrman Sparrow had, he led him to a nearby house and knocked on the door rhythmically. With a creak, the door opened automatically, revealing a dark environment blanketed with faint moonlight. The moment Emlyn and Klein entered, they saw the white shirt and black-vested Marek sitting on the sofa. The door behind them seemed to have a life of its own as it slammed to a close. After taking a glance at him, Emlyn smiled and pointed at him. "This is my partner, Mr. Gehrman Sparrow." Just as he finished speaking, he suddenly realized that the way Marek looked at him was even odder, as though he was examining an idiot. "Long time no see." Marek immediately stood up, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed at Sherlock Moriarty. Since the other party didn't appear in the image of Sherlock Moriarty, he definitely wouldn't take the initiative to mention such matters. "Long time no see." Klein took off his hat and surveyed the area. "Miss Sharon, please come out for the discussion. I have limited time." As he spoke, he took out a silver adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. A figure wearing a dark and complicated long dress holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads walked out from the void. The messenger summoned by the harmonica's historical projection was an objective existence. It didn't increase the spirituality burden of Furs. At the same time, Marek nodded and said, "All right." He cast his gaze on the high stool on the other side of the room. Emlyn looked at the wraith in a daze, then at Gehrman Sparrow and the spirit world creature he summoned. For some reason, he felt like he had been ostracized and didn't belong here. And on that high stool, a figure quickly outlined itself. Her skin was fair like a doll, and she wore an exquisite black regal dress and a small bonnet of the same color. Her blonde hair and blue eyes were slightly pale in color. Chapter 12:31 Visiting. Everywhere Emlyn subconsciously looked at the high stool on the other side of the room, and saw the exquisite doll. His eyes immediately revealed a look of amazement, admiration, ardor, and other mixed emotions. He opened his mouth and almost blurted out the question of where he could buy such a doll, and who was the master behind this piece of work. However, he was already an adult and had experienced plenty of things. He knew that bringing up such a question was very impolite, so he planned to find an opportunity to ask after the discussion on serious matters were finished. Sharon frowned indiscernibly as her body floated up. She bowed at Rionette Tinker and Sherlock Moriarty. "There's no need for small talk," Klein said simply. "Our initial plan is this." He shared how he would let his historical projection take the initiative to step into a trap to attract the attention of the Rose School of Thought and described it in detail. Sharon with her black bonnet listened quietly and said with a slightly ethereal voice, "They might not fall for it. After realizing that you are the attacker, that Shaman King will likely choose to retreat under the protection of sealed artifacts or angels. This way, it could only implicate a portion of the Rose School of Thought's strength." Without waiting for Klein and Emlyn to respond, Rionette Tinker's four heads opened their mouths and said at a faster pace, "Their main target should likely be me." Emlyn was a little lost hearing this, but he could roughly tell that the spirit world creature that Gehrman Sparrow had summoned had quite a status. Furthermore, it had a deep relationship with the Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction. "That's right. Even if the Mother Tree thinks highly of me, the setup would most likely attract Miss Messenger." After a moment of silence, Klein gave an addendum. "Madam, you and I will attack the other Shaman King in the form of historical void projections. Gehrman Sparrow is very respectful towards this spirit world creature." Just as this thought flashed through Emlyn's mind, he saw the 8 eyes on the forehead sweep at him. He shivered and instinctively joined in the discussion. Can this fool those from the Rose School of Thought? Since Klein had suggested that, he must have thought of a corresponding solution. "I have an item that can be lent to Miss Tinker." Having said that, he looked at Rionette Tinker and said, "That item can mimic the beyonder powers that surface in your mind. I hope you can use it to summon your past self, then move yourself into a concealed state and inject your consciousness into the projection. This way, the Rose School of Thought won't be able to discover anything abnormal in a short period of time. It's very likely that they will fall for it and gather all their strength to surround and kill you and me, allowing Miss Sharon and Emlyn to find a chance to launch a surprise attack. If they're more cautious than I thought." Klein paused for a moment before revealing a smile. "In that short period of time, if you join forces with me in your peak condition, there is a chance of killing the Shaman King despite him being under the protection of a sealed artifact. Now, the main point is, do you know enough about the beyonder powers to summon historical void projections, as well as entering into a concealed state? I can demonstrate the former to you, but I will think of a way for the latter." Rionette Tinker's four heads shook up and down at the same time. "I can, no problem. That's the general gist of it. You can confirm the details in the next few days." Klein silently estimated the time, as if he made his delivery succinct. Sharon nodded indiscernibly and said, "The most important thing is intel. Teacher can provide a portion of it. The rest can be obtained through magic mirror divination." Marek echoed, "I remember the symbol you drew back then." She also remembered that the question posed by the hidden existence didn't violate much of her privacy, and didn't bring about too much shame. Emlyn thought for a moment and carefully asked, "How do we communicate on both sides? If we can't grasp the timing accurately, the plan will definitely fail." The Blood Clan's Oath of Rose was unable to transmit what they saw and heard at such a great distance. Sharon glanced at Rionette Tinker and said, "Teacher's main body can stay on our side. 10 seconds after she enters a concealed state, we will take action. Once she exits the concealed state, we will immediately leave regardless of whether we succeed." "She." Emlyn jumped in fright as he instinctively turned his head to look at Gehrman Sparrow. He remembered very clearly that she was summoned by Mr. World. How terrifying. Emlyn didn't know if he was referring to the spirit world creature or Gehrman Sparrow. "After the intelligence gathering is done, you can communicate again." Seeing that it was almost time, Klein took off his hat and bade farewell. Emlyn's lips quivered, but he didn't ask anything in the end. He followed Gehrman Sparrow out of the house where Sharon and Marek were. Miss Messenger actually didn't ask for any gold coins. "This is because I'm helping her. If she really wants payment, All the gold coins I have are historical projections. I can only rely on Emlyn. I have to say, the bangle of spirituality that Emlyn provided to Miss Magician has pretty good effects. On the one hand, it can strengthen Miss Magician's spirituality, and on the other hand, it can speed up her spirituality recovery, allowing her to last this long. Just as the thoughts ran through Klein's mind, he heard Emlyn asked in puzzlement, "That ma'am, Miss Sharon is a Sequence 4 demigod of the mutant pathway?" "That's right. The potion's name is Puppet," Klein kindly informed him. Emlyn was instantly enlightened as he fell silent for 2 seconds before saying with a complicated expression, "If only she didn't speak or move, then she would be perfect." If it wasn't for the fact that a clown could be described as a master in terms of expression management, Klein nearly spewed a mouthful of water at Emlyn. He thought that the other party would praise Miss Sharon's beauty and doll-like characteristics, showing his infatuation and fervor, but in the end, "I can't understand what's on this fellow's mind." After controlling his urge to spew out whatever was in his mouth, Klein sighed inwardly. Emlyn glanced at him and seemed to have guessed what he was thinking. He scoffed and said, "Which two things do you like the most?" With Gairman Sparrow's character, he wouldn't have answered such a mundane question. However, he was still Sherlock Moriarty, a friend of the vampire in front of him. After some thought, he walked into the alley and casually said, "Money and delicacies. Then, I'll give you a stack of edible gold pounds. Would you like it?" Emlyn asked further as he walked beside Gairman Sparrow without any fear of the crazy adventurer like Miss Magician. Klein imagined it and felt that this would taint the value of the gold pounds, but also cause the delicacies to lose their attractiveness. Hence, he slowly shook his head. So, the corners of Emlyn's mouth curled up. "Although I also like exquisite, beautiful dolls and pure girls, if they were to combine together, it would inevitably make me find it a little odd. Yes, I believe that every doll of mine has their own character and story. If they suddenly come to life and not be like what I imagined, I would be very disappointed and worried. Of course, if I had the chance to obtain the puppet potion and sprinkle some on all my puppets, I might try it." As Emlyn spoke of his contradictory thoughts, he acted like a philosopher. If Miss Justice were here, she should be able to analyze Emlyn's mental state from such a reaction. Before he could respond, Klein's figure instantly faded and vanished. In the rental apartment where Furs and Zio lived. In front of the fireplace, Furs leaned back against the reclining chair with a pale face. She pulled up the wool blanket covering her body and, with the help of cogitation, entered a deep sleep. 2 hours later, she woke up feeling energized, but there was still some fatigue on her face. This Miss Magician took a slow, deep breath and extended her hand again, pulling Gairman Sparrow out of the air in front of her. Half of her demigod-level records, with a summoning of historical void projections. Klein glanced at her. This time, without even nodding his head, he directly teleported out of the house and entered an empty room in a hotel. 2 hours ago, he had been busy with Emlyn and Miss Sharon's matters. This time he had returned to Backlund for himself. Without wasting any time, Klein immediately took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew it. When Miss Messenger stepped out of the void once again, Klein recounted how he wanted to hunt the dark demonic wolf and finally asked, "Do you have any suggestions?" Rionette Tinker's 4 blonde, red-eyed heads bobbed up and down at the same time. "Sapphira Castle. In essence, it's the same as Palaz Zorost's answer." Klein pressed curiously, "How?" "I don't know." Rionette Tinker's 4 heads answered in unison. Klein silently exhaled and thanked her. "Sorry to trouble you. You can leave now." The blonde, red-eyed heads held by Rionette Tinker immediately replied. "Bill, Records, 4, 1351, September, 4, Gairman. Sparrow, owes, me, 1, gold coin." With that said, Sheet turned transparent and returned to the spirit world. Klein was stunned for 2 seconds before he slowly took out his wallet from his inner pocket and picked up a paper crane. "I have some questions to ask of you." He wrote on the paper crane he carried with him. After doing all of this, Klein lay on the bed and fell asleep. In the hazy dream world, he once again saw Willa Septon, who was lying in a black pram and wrapped in silver silk. "You're already over a year old. Do you still think you're a baby that's a few months old?" Pretending that he didn't see him sucking his fingers, Klein quickly described his conundrum. The plump Willa Septon retracted his thumb and sized up Klein. "Isn't the answer obvious?" "Ah." Klein was pleasantly surprised and puzzled. Willa Septon smiled and said, "You must have been eating too few desserts recently, causing your memory to be bad. Do you still remember what happens to a beyonder below an angel of the fate pathway when they see you directly? This. Klein's eyes lit up. Chapter 1232 Comparison Experiments. After becoming a demigod and gaining some level of control over Sapphira Castle, Klein was able to prevent its aura from permeating out into the real world and augmenting him. This made him stop considering similar problems. After all, this would result in abnormalities, causing him to be recognized by the beyonders of the fate pathway at a glance. It was rather unsafe. And at this moment, once he received Will Septon's reminder, he felt that it opened up new possibilities. When I was only a subsidiary to Sapphira Castle and only had the right to use it, the aura and projection of Sapphira Castle made a saint of the fate pathway not dare to look at me directly. I was equivalent to a mythical creature in the eyes to the corresponding low and mid-sequence beyonders. Now that I have initial control over Sapphira Castle, there's a high chance I can make the effects better. This can affect angels who are complete mythical creatures themselves. Sapphira Castle's level reaches that of sequence 0 at the very least? Yes, according to my deductions, it might even be higher than sequence 0. It has the trait that just knowing of it will result in corruption. Klein's mind whirred with activity as though streaks of lightning were flashing across his mind. He quickly made up his mind. After returning to the forsaken land of the gods, he would find the monsters in the depths of the darkness and do some experiments with the marionettes in the fog of history, so as to deduce if his idea worked. He smiled and said to the 1-year-old child in the black pram, "I understand what you mean. I'll get someone to send you ice cream soon." Will Septon, who was wrapped in silver silk, slowly turned his head and looked to the side. "No, there's no need. I've been eating too much ice cream during this period of time, and it's starting to affect my body's development." Klein pricked up his brows and asked, "Genuine, top-grade ice cream produced right from the Intis capital Trier. Give it to me next week." Will Septon hesitated before answering. With that said, the plump 1-year-old child turned around and buried his face into a tiny pillow in the pram. Due to the limited time Miss Magician had at maintaining the historical void projection, Klein didn't say anything else. Using his unique trait, he forcefully escaped the dream and woke up before getting out of bed. Right on the heels of that, he stretched out his right hand and repeatedly pulled at the air. 4 to 5 times later, his arms sank as he dragged out a woman wearing a simple linen robe with a tree bark belt. She was barefooted and had long black hair. She was a lady with average looks. The leader of the ascetics of the Church of Evernight, servant of concealment, Ariana. At the same moment, in Hillston Borough, in an apartment, Furs, who was sitting in a reclining chair, seemed to be pulled by invisible threads as she sat up abruptly. Her body straightened as the blood vessels on her forehead throbbed. She felt that her spirituality was like a flood that flowed towards the void in front of her, one that she couldn't stop no matter how hard she tried. She was on the brink of being sucked dry. In the next second, this sudden surge eased quite a bit, but it remained frightening. It wasn't something that she could handle now. In a hotel room, Klein spoke succinctly once he saw the historical void projection of Ma'am Ariana gaining sentience. "I plan on cooperating with others to deal with a particular shaman king of the Rose School of Thought." Ariana nodded gently, indicating that she understood, but she didn't give any suggestions. Seeing that the ascetic leader didn't give him any warnings, Klein felt a lot more at ease with the plan to hunt the Shaman King. He then said, "I've been planning on targeting the dark demonic wolf recently." Ariana opened her mouth slightly and said, "Be careful." Did she mean to say that I shouldn't belittle the dark demonic wolf, Koter? Just as he was about to ask a question, his consciousness suddenly blurred. He saw the woman opposite him and his reflection in her eyes fade away as they quickly disappeared. Thud. Furs collapsed into the reclining chair as her facial muscles twitched slightly. "This is more tiring than writing all night long." She gritted her teeth and tried cogitating to fall asleep. Extreme exhaustion might sometimes paradoxically cause insomnia to a person. In the forsaken land of the gods, near Noi's ancient city in the north, there was no one in the dark wilderness. With the lantern emitting a faint yellow light, Klein circled around to confirm his surroundings. Then he found a rock and sat down, no longer shielding the aura of the gray fog from seeping into reality. On this foundation, Klein consciously strengthened the projection that Sapphira Castle placed on him. After he was done with his preparations, he quickly turned a monster hidden in the darkness around him into a marionette. The marionette walked out of the darkness. Under the illumination of the lantern, it approached Klein and cast its gaze on him. In the eyes of this monster marionette, other than the coated and hatted Klein having deeper, more profound eyes. His temperament had also become even more indescribable. There wasn't much of a difference from before. After repeatedly testing the different types of monster marionettes, Klein confirmed that ordinary people, or most Beyonders, were unable to discover that he had the aura of Sapphira Castle on him. Following that, he reached out with his right hand and pulled out his body from half a day ago. He controlled the rather dull historical projection to cast his gaze over. This time, Klein saw a layer of grayish-white fog covering his body. Its interior was shimmering with light, but it didn't reveal its actual appearance. He then removed the projection support and attempted to pull out marionettist Rosago and other Beyonders of the seer pathway to repeat the experiment. Yes, after enhancing the projection, Beyonders of the seer pathway can directly discover something abnormal. However, those below the level of an angel can at least confirm that I'm related to Sapphira Castle. There's no way to directly see the strange door of light, which is also the projection of Sapphira Castle. This outcome wasn't too surprising for Klein. He took a deep breath and after preparing himself to rescue himself, he raised his hand and pulled out Winner Anuni from back when he hadn't been his marionette for long. Anuni raised his head bit by bit, and his eyes gradually reflected Klein's figure. There was a faint gray fog that emanated outwards. Deep in the fog, transparent or translucent twisted maggots were clustered around countless spherical lights. The spherical lights formed a door of light that was dyed bluish-black. The door of light was much clearer than before as it appeared even more textured. At the same time, its shape changed as it extended even higher up. This made it look like a tall and thin, brilliant figure. And the grayish-white fog around it was the figure's hooded robe. The spherical lights constantly flashed, making Klein feel like he was being watched by this deep, mysterious, towering, and terrifying figure with his numerous eyes. With a boom, Klein's head involuntarily tilted back as blood mixed with transparent maggots spurted out of his pores. The worms of spirit fell to the ground as they frantically rolled and struggled. Some of them rapidly dissipated, while some eventually calmed down before crawling back into his body and into his pores. Man, it's much better than directly losing consciousness and suffering memory loss the last time. Klein rubbed his temples and sighed silently. Anuni, who was standing in front of him, had already vanished because of the impact that Klein had received. Unable to maintain the historical void projection, Anuni vanished. This was also one of the reasons why Klein didn't suffer too much damage this time. Without Winner Anuni, he was unable to see the mutated strange door of light. This reduced the continuous assault on his senses. After 2 seconds, Klein entered the fog of history, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the gray fog. Looking at the faint dark glow rising from his body and melting away, Klein finally heaved a sigh of relief and gave a self-deprecating laugh. I nearly corrupted and corroded myself. In the future, I'll use Rosago and the other Beyonders of the seer pathway to do additional experiments. If there's no direct assault, I need to confirm if there will be a reverse corruption from Sapphira Castle's projection with the increase in observation time. The southern continent, East Balam, Failtech city that was under attack. Under the illumination of the crimson moon, the lone soldiers hiding behind a simple shelter took turns to rest to recover their energy. Their faces were black and covered with traces of gunpowder. Occasionally, someone would wake up and take out some dried tobacco leaves and casually roll it. Then they would use the remaining matchstick to light it up and bring it to their mouths to suck deeply at it. In turn, their eyes exuded mostly numbness and blankness. When the soldiers guarding this line of defense smelled the tobacco, they instinctively sniffed and looked over. Do you still have any more tobacco leaves? A soldier with a rifle asked his companion in a low voice. His comrade shook his head. I've already finished smoking it. I don't know when the next batch will arrive. I'm going crazy without the tobacco. The soldier who first spoke gestured outside the shelter with his chin. Do you see that? There are so many corpses, so many hands and feet. They all belong to living people. Before the sun set, the resistance had launched a fierce attack by feverishly storming the various defensive lines at Failtech City. Their disregard for their own lives frightened the lone soldiers and servant army who had been guarding the city. They almost had victory at hand, but ultimately failed to break through the critical line of defense. They left behind copious numbers of corpses before receding like the tide. His comrade fell silent for a moment before saying, Maybe tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, we will be joining them. Having said that, he looked up at the crimson moon and said in a dreamy voice, I wonder how Backlund is. I haven't received a letter from home in a long while. I wonder if they have enough food, or if they can find a doctor when they are sick. The soldier who had wanted to smoke was about to curse at the damn war and the damned enemy when his eyes suddenly widened. Trembling, he raised his right hand and pointed ahead. They're alive. One by one, the soldiers looked over and saw that under the crimson moon, the dismembered corpses that the resistance had left behind were beginning to crawl up one by one, swaying as they tried to approach the defense line. In the distance, a mysterious hooded person in black robe with embroidered crimson patterns stood behind the resistance and spread out his arms slightly. The spirituality of the entire battlefield was rapidly being nourished. Chapter 12:33 Two spots. Ever since the war became prolonged, the lone soldiers had seen countless unnatural phenomena. It happened so many that they were somewhat numb to it. However, the scene of the dismembered corpses crawling up remained a shocking scene. It left them horrified and confused. They felt as though they were unable to survive the impending disaster, and would eventually become zombies. Of course, there was a reason why they were able to maintain their morale after seeing such unnatural phenomena. Just as they were feeling extreme fear, a series of chants sounded from behind them. Lacking clothes and food, they have no shelter in the cold. The Evernight did not forsake them, but bestowed them with love. 1. The holy and sympathetic prayer reverberated across the entire defense line, causing the fear in every soldier to quickly dissipate, their bodies and minds turning tranquil. Then, a number of the soldiers followed orders and moved out cannons covered in silver patterns. They adjusted the muzzles and aimed at the dismembered corpses that were rushing at them. Boom! 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 Sparks flew as shells landed in different spots on the battlefield, exploding and emitting a thick darkness. The dismembered corpses collapsed, the strength within them vanishing. Otherwise, they were directly destroyed, returning to their eternal slumber. The mysterious black-robed man behind the resistance army raised his arms upon seeing this, as though he was hugging the crimson moon. At that moment, his body suddenly turned incorporeal. His body dyed a faint red as he transformed into a hazy ray of moonlight. The moonlight shattered instantly, turning into red scales before dissipating in place. Moonlight transformation. This was a beyonder power that a Sequence 5 Scarlet Scholar of the Apothecary Pathway possessed. To a Sequence 4 Shaman King, it was almost instinctive. And at the spot where the Shaman King had been, a figure quickly outlined itself. It was a huge cloth doll. It had blonde hair and bright red eyes, and wore a long black gothic dress with countless mysterious patterns engraved on it. Swirling around it was sinister vines. Its skin had a luster that no human should possess. Rionette Tinker. She had used the Staff of the Stars to summon herself, back when she was in perfect condition. Of course, the Staff of the Stars that was lent to Miss Messenger was the real one. Klein had brought it back to the real world from above the gray fog ahead of time. If that wasn't the case, it would be equivalent to Klein's historical projection summoning a Staff of the Stars projection. Then, the projection of the Staff of the Stars would summon Rionette Tinker in her peak state. The whole burden would be placed on Furs, causing her spirituality to be quickly drained. A solution to this problem was to temporarily lend the actual Staff of the Stars to Rionette Tinker. The draining of spirituality would be borne by this ancient bane. At the same time, Rionette Tinker was probably one of the existences that were the least afraid of the negative effects of the staff. As a key representative of the Temperance faction, and as a puppet and a cloth doll, she could stop unwanted scenes from surfacing in her mind. And after changing into a concealed state, the Staff of the Stars could hardly affect her historical void projection. The peak state Rionette Tinker had attempted to sneak closer to directly possess the Rose School of Thought's Shaman King and instantly end the battle. However, the other party had discovered the danger ahead of time. Using the moonlight's illumination, he was one step ahead of the Wraith's possession. Amidst the crimson glow that enveloped the ground, red scales rapidly reformed into the black-robed, hooded Rose School of Thought Shaman King. His eyes were closed tightly, not daring to look at the ancient bane opposite him. At the same time, on the other side of the battlefield, a figure rapidly appeared. It was none other than Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a black trench coat and a half-top hat. He had a transparent glove on his left hand as he raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Scarlet flames rose up from various parts of the battlefield, as if they were announcing the beginning of a grand performance. Just as the Shaman King finished reforming, he reached out his left hand and tore apart the clothes on his chest. At that moment, Rionette Tinker's bright red eyes reflected his figure. If things went as expected, the Rose School of Thought Shaman King would have transformed into a rabbit or a goat in the next second. He would lose most of his characteristics and beyonder powers, but his body only emitted a faint glow without any change. His exposed chest revealed a long, thin brown puppet which was embedded there. The puppet seemed to grow out of the Shaman King's body. Its body connected to his internal organs. Its eyes and mouth were like crescents. The surface of its body was grown with dried flowers and withered grass, giving off an indescribable bizarreness in the moonlight. Suddenly, the puppet was dyed red as though it was soaked in blood. It immediately turned into a pool of mud that surged into the organs of the Shaman King. Amidst the mud, an arm stretched out. Its surface was flowing with a black sticky liquid that kept protruding out with strange objects. Some were skulls, some had barbed tongues, while others had three-dimensional eyes. Abomination Sua. This Rose School of Thought's leader, an existence at Sequence 1, had crossed the vast distance and descended with the help of prior arrangements. That evil aura instantly caused the surrounding members of the Rose School of Thought and supporting members to either die, mutate, or wildly attack their comrades. Apart from the Shaman King, no one was spared. West Balam, in a port city. Shaman King Klarman, who wielded the highest authority here, stood at the top floor of a cathedral that once belonged to the Church of Evernight as he looked down at the sparsely lit city. In a house not far away, Emlyn White glanced at the doll-like Sharon and took out a bronze box with many ruby gems embedded in it. Inside the box was an eyeball-shaped glass sphere. It was a sealed artifact which Emlyn had requested from the Sanguine, known as the Vision of White, an artifact of the Sun Domain. It was very effective at dealing with the mutant pathways demigods and shaman kings. It could even be considered able to restrain them in certain aspects. Of course, it wouldn't feel any sense of pity and kindness just because Emlyn and Sharon were beyonders on its side. Upon seeing Sharon nod slightly to indicate that there were no problems, Emlyn's body phased away as the moonlight that shone into the room, and he disintegrated into a series of colorful red scales. At the apex of the nearby cathedral, Klarman was pacing back and forth with his puffy black and white hair. He sneered at the city's Nighthawks and mandated punishers for moving the lone citizens and all the sealed artifacts away ahead of time. If the group consisted only of beyonders, it wouldn't be impossible to escape, but with so many ordinary people, how can you effectively move without being noticed? There's no need for me to send people to track you. Simply locking down the surrounding docks and food supplies is enough to break you down without my interference. As he muttered silently to himself, this Shaman King, who had been active in the southern continent since the early 5th epoch and was even suspected to be dead, cast his gaze out the window and stared at the crimson moon high in the sky. Previously, the abnormal phenomenon of the crimson moon turning white made Klarman feel the anger of the primordial moon. He had always felt uneasy and disturbed. He had become a primordial moon believer over time while researching natural interactions, secret deeds, and other mysterious knowledge. Normally, it was relatively easy for a Shaman King to live 1,000 years, but later on, his physical condition waned, an irreversible form of aging and the decay of his spirit body. Therefore, 1,200 years was commonly the natural limit of Shaman Kings and Sanguine Earls. To continue living, one could only rely on various methods to survive. For example, sealing oneself and sleeping in a coffin deep within a castle. Klarman was nearly 1,400 years old and still brimming with energy. He didn't need to limit his movements, because he had received the primordial moon's blessings. This was also the reason why he had disappeared for so many years. Later on, he received a revelation from the primordial moon and joined the Rose School of Thought. In this aspect, Klarman always had his suspicions. Sometimes, he believed that the Mother Tree of Desire and the primordial moon were one entity. They were different sides of the same great existence. Yet, there were other times when he felt that the Mother Tree of Desire and the primordial moon were not only different, but there was also a deep conflict between them. This resulted in the primordial moon believers not getting enough attention when they later joined the Rose School of Thought. Apart from receiving some bestowments in the form of items, they were placed in non-critical positions. Just as Klarman was focused on sensing the crimson moon in an attempt to gain a revelation, the crimson moonlight that fell onto the cathedral's bell tower had pure red scales of light appear as they gathered together. It then manifested into Emlyn White, who wore a tuxedo and a bow tie. Behind this Sanguine, a thick black gas emanated, forming a pair of illusory bat wings. Emlyn had already consumed the corresponding potion to remove his scent and spirituality fluctuations, allowing him to approach his target in secret. Of course, he was up against a demigod, a Sequence 4 demigod of the same pathway. Even if he was fully prepared, he didn't dare get too close, or else he would easily be discovered. Looking at the window where Shaman King Klarman was, he examined the projection on the glass for a second. Emlyn White opened the bronze box with the rubies embedded in it, and he used his black velvet-gloved left hand to pick up the vision of White. His expression twisted as he experienced the pain that came from being exposed to the blazing sun. Suppressing the pain, Emlyn pushed the eyeball-shaped glass sphere to his right eye. All the buildings in front of him had suddenly disappeared from his vision, leaving only shadows of cold, crimson, or fallen evil. Among them, there was a figure that was like a huge black whirlpool that was crazily devouring the light around it, causing his body to become distorted. This was Emlyn's target, the ancient Shaman King, Klarman. A ray of light immediately lit up, condensing into a scorching, blinding light. It shot out from the vision of White and went straight for the figure behind the glass window. 1. Adapted from Job 24 verse 8, Old Testament. Chapter 12:34 The projection's descent. The blinding white beam penetrated the glass window and landed on Shaman King Klarman. It then burst into an intense light, melting away all the undead, darkness, and evil. Klarman's figure burned with a white flame, as though he was a paper figurine that had been brought near red embers. But it really was a paper figurine, one that seemed to be condensed from the crimson moonlight. The Shaman King's substitute spell, Moon Paper Figurine. As the paper figurine turned to ash, the ancient Shaman King appeared at the top of the cathedral and cast his cold gaze at Emlyn White, who was standing near the bell tower. At that moment, within Klarman's blood-red eyes, it reflected the figure of Sharon, who was wearing a black regal dress and a tiny bonnet. Her body stiffened as if she had lost control of herself. Seeing this, Emlyn didn't hesitate. It was as if he had practiced it 1,000 times before. He aimed his vision of White at the Shaman King's left chest and prepared to activate the Sun Domain's unshadowed spear. As long as this attack struck Klarman's heart, this Shaman King Klarman wouldn't be able to use Moonlight Transformation to resolve it. It would also be difficult for him to recover using an artificial vampire's super recovery abilities. Of course, this would definitely cause more serious damage to Sharon, who had possessed Klarman. However, if they could quickly resolve their target, she was willing to pay the corresponding price. In the previous discussions, Emlyn, Sharon, and Marek had already discussed a few similar plans and had come to a consensus. This was also the reason why Sharon didn't restrict Shaman King Klarman by tightening his clothes. Compared to a wraith's possession, that was easier to resolve for the opponent who could use Moonlight Transformation. As for whether Klarman would be ashamed of running naked, the answer from the magic mirror was no. Taking all these under consideration, they eventually chose to let Emlyn White attack the target, so as to deplete his moon paper figurine to create an opportunity for Sharon to possess him. The transparent glass sphere in Emlyn's hand glowed once again, extending out into a blazing spear that had turned extremely white. But at this moment, Klarman, who was standing at the top of the cathedral, suddenly underwent a transformation. A crack quickly split open in the middle of his forehead, as if there was a blood moon embedded in it. Moonlight surged out like a tidal wave, causing the illusory blonde blue-eyed Sharon to float out of his body uncontrollably. Klarman's stiff and slow movements barely restored to normal and, under the radiance of the full moon, he turned into a pool of blood, splitting into countless fragments of light. His figure rapidly took form on another steeple of the cathedral. Clinging closely behind him was Sharon. As for the unshadowed spear that Emlyn had created, it passed through the spot where Klarman was originally standing and flew into the distance, expanding into a miniature sun. The entire port city was illuminated. At the same time, Klarman's right shoulder began to squirm before something tore through his black robe and burrowed out. This was an exquisite male doll. It was only the size of a palm and wore a dark red, gold-patterned tuxedo. Its eyes had been dug out, leaving behind 2 black holes. The puppet sat on Klarman's shoulder and raised its hands, tapping all its fingers as though it was playing an invisible instrument. Sharon's figure was immediately ejected from Klarman's back, as though she suffered a serious repulsion. Emlyn felt his clothes tighten as they bound him tightly. His bow tie also came alive in a bid to strangle him to death. That doll was a Grade 1 sealed artifact given to Klarman by the Rose School of Thought. It was called the General of the Pupilless Eye. It was an item formed by a Sequence 4 demigod of the mutant pathway, who had suffered a sudden death due to an accident. It had a living characteristic and could possess objects with spirits and awaken objects that didn't according to its wielder's will. However, the wielder needed to feed it with their flesh and blood. Otherwise, it would gradually grow its eyes. Once the sealed artifact was in a good condition, It would transform into an evil spirit that chased after its original owner while abhorring all humans. When Emlyn heard the sound of his bones crying in pain from the burden, the vision of white that was burning his soul emitted a bright glow, turning the surrounding area into a land without shadows or evil. The effects of general of the pupil less eye had on his clothes were severed. However, at that moment, Clawman had already indiscernibly muttered a particular word with a cruel smile. He reached out his hands and pulled out an illusory door with many mysterious symbols engraved on it out of thin air. This was the door of summoning. The Moon Pathways Sequence 3 was Summoning Master. Under the illumination of the full blood moon on his forehead, Clawman, who was only at the Shaman King level, was able to complete a summoning. However, because of this, there was a certain change in his overall aura. He had lost a lot of his rationality, and his madness had deepened. Amidst the illusory creaking, the door of summoning opened up a crack. In the gaps, 2 human palms reached out. Their skin had no luster to it, and they lacked texture. They were like a most inferior cloth doll. Outside Failtech City, the Rose School of Thought believers and followers who had originally planned on attacking the Lone Army's defense line after the Corpse Horde's attack had begun to kill each other, their rationality completely gone. Some of them, who were originally ordinary people, bent their backs and grew grayish-black wolf fur. The corners of their mouths tore open as sticky saliva constantly dripped. Some of their skin was dyed black and had become as hard as steel. Some lost their hearts and fell to the ground, only to get back on their feet as though nothing had happened. Some of their bodies turned transparent, as if they had become shadows. The descent of Abomination Sua's aura had tainted all the living creatures in the vicinity, causing them to either break down and suffer a tragic death, or turn into werewolves or zombies. As a high-ranking Sequence 1, he could directly bestow the power unto his believers, but there was a time limit. However, this method might not be the hope of the resistance. On the other side of the battlefield, over 2,000 meters away, behind the lone shelter. Although the soldiers didn't see or hear anything, transparent blisters began growing on the surface of their skin, and their minds were filled with thoughts of venting all kinds of emotions and desires. It wouldn't take long for them to go mad one by one and turn into irrational beasts. Across this base, even to the interior of Failtech City, it would be a challenge to find humans who could still maintain their clarity of mind. Suddenly, they heard a chant. It was a chant formed from sacred and ethereal voices. This chant came from the Evernight Cathedral in the city. It was as though there were many choirs praising the goddess. The soldiers, citizens, and officers fell asleep one after another behind the shelter, inside the trenches, and on the streets. They dreamed of a tranquil darkness, moonflowers, and night vanilla. Their bodies and minds became extremely peaceful, and they were no longer affected by evil. In the Evernight Cathedral in Failtech City, the high-ranking deacon of the Nighthawks, the goddess's eye, Ilya, tried her best to maintain the dream that enveloped the entire city. She was unable to interfere with the demigod battle outside. At the same time, Klein and Rionette Tynker felt the change in the surrounding spirituality. It seemed to transform into layers of barriers that attempted to restrain them and restrict their actions. And in the bloody mud on the Shaman King's chest, a lump of squirming flesh covered in black sticky liquid drilled out right on the heels of Sua's arm, forming the body of this abomination. He was like a huge tree that had been splashed with oil. The extended branches were arms which had various strange objects protruding out. On the surface of the trunk that was covered in thick black liquid, bloodshot eyes kept rolling. It cleared the minds of the onlookers, turning them into rabbits, goats, and pigs. The dozens of arms rapidly extended outwards. Some of them sealed off the sky, while others burrowed into the ground. The rest either surrounded them from all sides or headed straight for Klein and Rionette Tynker. At the same time, Abomination Sua let out a roar that pierced straight into one's spirit body. It caused the 2 targets to tremble at the same time, causing a certain degree of stiffness to rear its head. It made the crimson moonlight in midair become even richer, allowing a scene to appear on the red screen. The core to this scene was a mummy wrapped in a yellowing bandage. It had been pierced by countless brown tree branches and was suspended in midair. Its stomach bulged, and at times, different parts bulged and shriveled, as if it was giving birth to new life. The mummy's mouth was agape as it kept screaming. Although Klein couldn't hear any actual sounds, he felt pain resonating with his body and soul, slowly burdening him with the mummy's predicament. The Chained God. The roar of Abomination Sua was formed from ancient Hermes words that exceeded the imagination of humans. It was essentially praying to the Chained God, and he had successfully received a response. The Mother Tree of Desire was unable to infuse too much power into reality. If one wanted to pray to her and obtain feedback at the angel level, they required a large-scale ritual. Of course, the influence the Mother Tree of Desire directly exerted and her attention via the Chained God had qualitative differences. The Chained God was originally not a true god, but he had contained the mutant pathway's uniqueness and two sequence 1 beyonder characteristics, making him a king of angels. After giving birth to Abomination Sua, he even lost a sequence 1 beyonder characteristic. When he was completely overwhelmed by the Mother Tree of Desire, he similarly suffered a life of isolation. Therefore, regardless of the essence of the Mother Tree of Desire, the effect she had on reality was limited due to the indirect methods used. But no matter what, the trap targeted at Rionette Tinker was luxurious enough. As the projection of the Chained God appeared, the entire land was dyed with a dark red color. Klein felt that his connection with the spirit world had been severed, and he could no longer use teleportation. His figure instantly leaped into a sea of flames. Taking advantage of the opportunity when Rionette Tinker was fighting against Sua, he reached his hand into the void and grabbed at different spots. Finally, Klein pulled out a silver-black jewelry box embedded with various gems. Then, without any hesitation, he opened the second level. Box of the Great Old Ones. This Grade 0 sealed artifact's second level could transfer all living beings within its range to a particular scene recorded by it. Chapter 1235 Most Valued Supper. The silver-black, three-tiered accessory box with many embedded gems quickly opened, revealing the interior of the second level. It was dark. Even the surrounding barriers seemed to blend in with it. It gave one the feeling that it was a pocket of infinite space. In an instant, the darkness lit up with countless resplendent speckles, as if they had transformed into a miniature cosmos, a miniature universe. These bright points of light rapidly spun as the surrounding scene changed several times in a second. What Klein expected was to move Abomination Sua, the Rose School of Thought shaman, and many of their followers to the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. By making them leave the southern continent, they wouldn't be able to immediately sense that Klarman had been attacked. This way, they wouldn't be able to provide any timely and effective assistance. However, the second level of the Box of the Great Old Ones had an element of randomness to it. The act of sending things to the designated scene succeeded a handful of times. Most of the time, the selected destination would suffer an unavoidable change. This was something that couldn't be influenced with luck, and at the very least, no one below Sequence 0 could do so. Therefore, when he opened the second level of the Box of the Great Old Ones, Klein didn't know what would happen. It was the same as not using any beyonder powers to cheat at gambling. He had to rely solely on observation to push out all his chips. This left his heart filled with anxiety. Of course, he wasn't too worried. No matter where the Box of the Great Old Ones brought him and Miss Messenger, it was impossible to harm him in any way. After all, Rionette Tinker was fake, the Box of the Great Old Ones was fake, and even he himself was fake. With this in consideration, even if he was thrown underground by the Box of the Great Old Ones and faced a terrifying corruption, Klein could instantly dispel the historical void projection, enter Sapphira Castle to do a complete disinfection, and sever all connections. Building on this foundation, he had the ability to help Miss Messenger's main body resist the corruption. Since it wasn't directly experienced, through the layer of a historical projection, the outcome was relatively better. The only thing he needed to worry about was that the random scene selected by the Box of the Great Old Ones was where Miss Sharon and Emlyn were attacking Shaman King Klarman. That way, it would be equivalent to leading the main enemy force to head straight for his headquarters. This meant that they could only consider giving up on the operation, and he and Rionette Tinker would undertake the responsibility of helping all participants escape from the battlefield and escape the southern continent. The probability of this happening was very low, but he had to be wary. At that moment, due to the influence of Abomination Sua's aura, Klein's spirituality had frozen quite a bit. It seemed to bind his body and soul, but it still flowed into the Box of the Great Old Ones, maintaining its open state. In the blink of an eye, the scene in the second level of the Box of the Great Old Ones changed, revealing a tiny vast sea. Klein, Rionette Tinker, Abomination Sua, the Hooded Shaman King, and many Rose School of Thought believers and subordinates saw endless yellow sand in the extreme cold of the night. Other than the projection of the Chained God, all the living beings on the battlefield were instantly transported to a desert. As for the projection, due to the departure of Abomination Sua, the connection was severed, preventing his powers from seeping into reality. Without the luxury of time to examine where he was currently, Klein dispelled the box of the Great Old Ones and snapped his fingers, summoning a scarlet flame as he constantly jumped within them. He had done so to avoid the attention of Abomination Sua, as well as grab the opportunity to complete the summoning of the historical void projection. At that moment, he heard an extremely evil roar. His mind suddenly went blank, and he temporarily lost all his thoughts. The scarlet flames he was immersed in came alive as well and like a cage, bound him to the ground. With just a roar and the influence of some auras, Abomination Sua had already restrained him to a certain extent. If it wasn't for the fact that Rionette Tinker, who was in her peak condition, was his teammate, Klein's projection would have been helplessly executed. Perhaps his actual body would suffer certain effects. At this moment, the huge doll the size of a castle took a step forward and opened its tightly shut mouth. There was no sound, but the distorted wood that was covered in pitch-black liquid seemed to encounter a flood dike. It repelled backward and raised the arms with strange protruding objects. This was a curse that Rionette Tinker had been silently accumulating for a very, very long time. The root of the curse was the anger, hatred, and herb grudge that had emerged after she suffered an attack. However, Abomination Sua didn't show any obvious changes. He only staggered a little and froze for a second before returning to normal. High-level existences were always able to restrain low-level beyonders of the same pathway. They could even exert a certain influence over space. And using this opportunity to escape the restraints of the flames, Klein used Creeping Hunger to flash to another side, avoiding the Blood Moon arrow created by the Rose School of Thought's Shaman King. He didn't dare to look directly at Abomination Sua. He seized the opportunity and reached out with his right hand to pull out from the void ahead. This time, he didn't drag anything out. Klein continued blinking about and repeated his actions. Then, he successfully dragged out a figure. It was none other than the leader of the Church of Evernights Ascetics, the Angel of the Concealment Domain, Ariana, who wore a simple linen robe and a tree bark belt. My report from before worked after all. A thought flashed through his mind as he activated Creeping Hunger once again and teleported elsewhere. The eyes of Ariana's projection darted slightly as her eyes instantly turned dark and deep. Following that, she joined in the battle between Rionette Tinker and Abomination Sua. With her help, Rionette Tinker, who was in a rather difficult situation and trying hard to create opportunities for him, finally managed to catch her breath. She didn't get possessed by Abomination Sua, nor did she become a real doll. The Rose School of Thought's Shaman King showcased his well-rounded aspect towards the darkness and moon domains. He attempted to use spells like Abyss Shackles to restrict Klein's movement, but the short-distance blinking was simply too effective. Without the projection of the chained god and his influence of the surrounding area, and the interference of Abomination, Klein was like a fish in water. He was free and relaxed. He only needed to consider how to deal with his enemy's spells every tube teleports. However, the Shaman King could hardly stop him in an effective manner due to the unpredictability of where he would appear next. During this process, Klein grabbed at the void a few more times until he dragged out a figure. This figure had bronze skin, black hair, and brown eyes. His facial features were soft and his gaze was cold. He wore a deep black robe embroidered with golden thread. He wore a golden crown and was none other than the former Death Consul, Isaac Eggers. Another angel. The Shaman King's eyelids twitched as he watched. At this moment, Abomination Sua suddenly inserted multiple black arms into the desert. The desert nearby boiled and was blanketed with a thick black liquid. This extended into the distance and invaded the void, disrupting the overlapping of reality and the spirit world. Taking advantage of the fact that his teleportation wasn't completely affected, Klein blinked behind Mr. Isaac. With him shielding him, he quickly grabbed at the air a few times. His arm suddenly sank and he pulled out a silvery white snake's tail. Another angel. The reason why he dared to directly summon the three angels was because this historical void projection of his was summoned by Rionette Tinker using the Staff of the Stars. The spirituality consumed was born by this ancient bane, not Furs. Otherwise, Furs would have already fainted the moment the Servant of Concealment, Ariana, descended. There was no way she could endure spirituality expenditure such as this. Furz's purpose was to first summon Gehrman Sparrow's historical projection so that he had plenty of time to set up the ritual and bring the Staff of the Stars to the real world. Then, the maintenance of the historical projection would be dispelled, allowing him to return to the fog and have Rionette Tinker summoned another him. In less than 10 seconds, as Abomination Sua had focused his attention on Rionette Tinker and subconsciously belittled Klein, leading him to not only losing the help of the chained god's projection, but also being thrown from the state of being the one who had laid an ambush to the one being besieged by 4 powerful angels. Without any hesitation, this sequence one angel opened his mouth and chanted in ancient Hermes words. He had once again prayed to the chained god. When the door of summoning opened in front of Shaman King Klarman, just the extension of 2 trembling hands was enough for a thought to abruptly flash across Emlyn White's mind. The other angel of the Rose School of Thought, the King of Curses, Baranka. This was information provided by Sharon and Marek. Upon seeing this, Emlyn's mind tensed up. Without any hesitation, he waved his arm and threw the vision of white at the door of summoning. This was partly because he was experiencing a battle at the demigod level for the first time, so he couldn't help but overreact. On the other hand, he wasn't worried about losing the vision of white. After all, it belonged to the sanguine. At worst, he would repay it in the future over time. At the same time, even without the sealed artifact, he still had other mystical items to use, such as Lamino's travels. With the notebook, Emlyn could summon the unshadowed crucifix to replace the vision of white. After the eyeball-shaped glass sphere flew out, it continuously absorbed the light along the way, bringing with it extreme darkness. When it got close to the door of summoning, the vision of white suddenly exploded into an extremely brilliant glow. Like a blazing sun at noon, it enveloped both the hands and the door, melting away all evil, degenerate, darkness, filth, and undead auras. The full blood moon on Klarman's forehead was clearly affected. All the light beams were compressed to his side, preventing him from affecting his surroundings. Seizing this opportunity, Sharon's figure that appeared in midair distorted, turning into a human-sized puppet. This puppet was identical to Shaman King Klarman. It had messy black and white hair and a pair of bright red eyes. As for Emlyn, he raised his left arm and revealed a translucent ring that was worn outside his gloved index finger. The ring seemed to be made of light red amber, and there was a blood-colored gem embedded on it. Lilith's ring. This was a ring personally made by the sanguine ancestor, the ancient goddess, Lilith. It could project a door that led deep into the spirit world for a certain amount of time, summoning an unknown creature. Emlyn wasn't sure what he would obtain. He only knew that, under normal circumstances, the summoned object was usually slightly stronger than him, but the possibility of directly pulling out a demigod wasn't impossible. At the tip of the ring, the blood-colored gem emitted a faint glow as an illusory door covered in mysterious patterns appeared in front of Emlyn. The door creaked open, the gap in the door widening. Shaman King Klarman had just recovered his senses from the sun's illumination when he saw a moon rise up behind the door of summoning. It was a bright moon, one that was slightly silver in color. Chapter 1236 Linkage in the eyes of Shaman King Klarman. A bright silver moon rose, quickly filling his irises. This was completely different from the normal crimson moon. It also wasn't the blood moon that occasionally appeared. It was similar to the abnormal state of the moon from not too long ago, but there were also certain differences. It illuminated Klarman's eyes and body, causing him to instantly lose contact with the crimson moon. That also meant that, before things went back to normal, Klarman could no longer attempt moonlight transformation, nor could he teleport within the range of the crimson moonlight's illumination. Suddenly, a word appeared in the mind of this shaman king of the moon domain. Lilith. The ancient goddess, Lilith, who once controlled the moon pathway. Such a change was out of Emlyn's expectations, but Sharon, who was good at controlling her emotions and thoughts, wasn't affected. Despite having become a Klarman puppet, she raised her right hand and yanked some of her messy black and white hair. Almost at the same time, on the Shaman King's head, a tuft of white hair fell on its own without him suffering any attacks. The door of summoning he had just opened had been dissolved by the full might of the vision of white sun rays. This wasn't because the Rose School of Thought's angel, who had been summoned, was unable to resist the Grade 1 sealed artifact, but that the door of summoning couldn't withstand such a special attack. In addition, the King of Curses, Baranka, had only extended 2 hands out. This limited the amount of power that could remotely be projected via his descent. The evil aura that permeated into the real world had also been purified by the vision of white, preventing it from affecting Sharon and Emlyn. At that moment, without the door of summoning, Baranka could only retreat to where he was originally. He had to wait for the next summoning or for Shaman King Klarman to pray. As an angel, he had the status required to respond to prayers throughout the world. When that strand of hair fell, Sharon, in her Klarman puppet state, didn't hesitate. Her right hand naturally slid down from her forehead. She grabbed the exaggerated crack that had the full blood moon embedded there and forcefully pressed it down. Klarman couldn't help but let out a blood-curdling scream. The flesh on his forehead turned into a bizarre blur as they filled up the terrifying crack, blocking the miniature full moon. This was one of the beyonder powers of a Sequence 4 puppet of the mutant pathway, called the Source of Curses. Apart from being able to influence non-living creatures, puppets could also turn into mystical puppets and magical paper figurines. Through the connections established, they could use various methods to curse their targets. This beyonder power would undergo a qualitative change when they reached Sequence 3. At the current stage, it resulted in mutually destructive damage. Under normal circumstances, puppet demigods rarely used it. In other words, a puppet had to hurt themselves to hurt their enemy. The reason why Sharon dared to do so was because she was certain that since both she and her target were at Sequence 4, as a wraith and zombie, she would definitely be able to withstand the damage better than a vampire. After knowing in advance that Shaman King Klarman had a Grade 1 sealed artifact, General of the Pupil SI, Sharon had never thought of truly succeeding with Wraith's possession. Her main goal was to use this method to establish a connection with Klarman to prepare for the subsequent curse. The tuft of hair she plucked symbolized the official start of the curse. Destroying the target's full blood moon on his forehead was to prevent him from establishing the door of summoning once again, which would lead to pulling a Rose School of Thought's angel into the battlefield. Of course, as a demigod, Klarman wasn't going to die so easily from a curse. In the past, he would be able to use moonlight transformation and illusory bats to weaken the damage brought by the curse. Then, via constantly moving at high speeds, he could avoid attacks while chanting the honorific name of a Rose School of Thought's angel. However, under the silvery white moon's illumination, his body seemed to freeze, preventing him from completing the series of actions. While Klarman's mind raced, the General of the Pupil SI puppet on his shoulder stood up and let out an ear-piercing scream. The glass windows around them shattered, transforming into bullets that shot towards the floating Sharon. Without anyone controlling the eyeball-like glass sphere, it flew up on its own, causing a gigantic pillar of light that had flames swirling around it to descend. The pillar of light enveloped Sharon, causing the surroundings to turn bright as though it was daytime. The General of the Pupil SI could influence ownerless mystical items, allowing them to help it. Amidst the flaring sun, Sharon, who had transformed into Klarman, showed clear signs of melting as her face contorted uncontrollably. Half the large number of glass fragments melted into the pillar of light while the other half pierced through her body. Klarman once again let out a tragic cry. It made Emlyn's body turn cold as his blood seemed to frost up. One bloody hole after another appeared on the Shaman King's body. He was like a candle that had been thrown into a furnace as he slowly softened and the oils from his fat dripped. Any damage from Source of Curses would be reflected onto the target. As a demigod of the Rose School of Thought, there was no doubt that Klarman knew of this. His action just now was to use this exchange of damage to force Sharon to stop the curse. The theurgical spells of the Sun Domain clearly dealt more damage to evil creatures that were the likes of puppets, wraiths, zombies, and werewolves than vampires, Potions Professor, Scarlet Scholar, and Shaman Kings. That was to say, the continuous flaring sun strikes caused Sharon to dissipate, but it would only be able to severely injure Klarman. As for the demigods of the moon pathway, they had extremely strong self-recovery abilities. In just a second, Shaman King Klarman used his rich experience and deep knowledge of mysticism to accurately grasp the problem of the Source of Curses, and chose the most suitable method to see results in the shortest time possible. However, at that moment, having lost the vision of Emlyn White, who had summoned the strange moon, regained his senses. He took out a bronze-green hard-covered notebook and flipped it to one of the pages. A crackling sound could be heard as bolts of lightning appeared out of thin air, interweaving into a storm that emitted a strong destructive aura. Instantly, the Shaman King Klarman was swept in. Laymanos Travels. Thunderstorm. Having temporarily lost moonlight transformation and the ability to blink within a certain range, Klarman was unable to dodge the attack. He was smote by bolts of silver lightning. Sharon took the opportunity to dispel Source of Curses, to prevent the damage dealt to the target from being reflected onto her. However, her face was clearly much paler than before, and her breathing became weaker. The pillar of light from blazing sun had indeed caused quite a significant amount of damage to her. The silvery white blob that blasted quickly extinguished, and Klarman's body was already pitch black. His charred skin and flesh were constantly peeling off. Pieces of flesh were squirming and growing. The general of the pupil-less eye's body rapidly turned incorporeal, as though it had turned into a spectre. It was prepared to possess Klarman and move him away from the area to prevent any subsequent blows. At this moment, a blonde red-eyed head suddenly appeared and bit the head of the exquisite doll. Klarman, who remained groggy, subconsciously looked over and saw a headless lady. This lady was wearing a dark and complicated gothic long dress and holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads. Rionette Tynker. In that vast desert, the eyes of Rionette Tynker, who was attacking Abomination Sua with Azek, Ariana, and the giant silver serpent, suddenly glazed over. Her actions turned stiff as she attacked purely on instinct. This was part of Klein's plan. When the battle on this side had stabilized, with Abomination Sua was unable to extricate himself from it within a short period of time, Rionette Tynker's main body would dispel its concealed state. She would then return to the real world and quickly help Sharon and Emlyn finish the battle. Looking at the tragic-looking mummy projection in midair, as Klein controlled the 3 angels to hold back Abomination Sua, he used their auras to influence the environment around him. He switched from teleportation to flaming jump, and he continued to deal with the Rose School of Thought's Shaman King. During this process, he appeared carefree and relaxed, but in fact, he realized that the affinity between his body and his soul was decreasing bit by bit. His body was gradually becoming a spirit cage, causing his actions to become stiffer and heavier. This reminded him of the core description of prisoner. The body was the cage of the heart, and the world was the cage of the body. As time passed, he understood the meaning of this sentence from another angle. After Abomination Sua began to direct his attention at him, even if he didn't have the chance to attack him directly, he was still able to make him suffer some form of corrosion. After one of Rionette Tynker's heads was in control of General of the Pupil-less eye, another head raised the black staff that it was biting down on with its teeth. The gem-embedded staff lit up with a misty glow. A figure quickly took shape. It was none other than Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a top hat and a trench coat while holding Death Knell. Bang! A silver-black stream of light flew out and accurately hit Klarman's body. Klarman's thoughts came to a halt as he froze on the spot. Control Spirit Bullet. This was the Control Spirit Bullet shot by Gehrman Sparrow that the Staff of the Stars had reenacted. This 0 to 62 sealed artifact could allow the Beyonder powers and people that surfaced in the minds of the wielder to descend upon reality, while the latter could launch a single attack. On the other side, Sharon immediately turned into a puppet that looked identical to Klarman. She retracted her right hand and ruthlessly stabbed it into her chest. Blood sprayed out as Klarman gaped his mouth, unable to make a sound. To a wraith, the heart definitely wasn't a vital point, but to a vampire, it was lethal. Without giving Klarman any chance to resist, Emlyn flipped through Lamino's travels once again and released the recording of Historical Void Summoning, and took out the bronze unshadowed crucifix. His fingers pressed down on a spike, allowing blood to flow out to cleanse the mottled cross. A pure, burning white spear instantly condensed. After Sharon removed Source of Curses, Emlyn threw out the long spear of light and watched it pierce through Shaman King Klarman's chest, pinning him to the high walls of the cathedral. Bright light suddenly expanded and completely extinguished Klarman's last breath. Unshadowed Spear. In the vast desert, Klein suddenly stopped, and while facing Abomination Sua and the Shaman King, he took off his hat, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed. His body faded and disappeared. During this process, Klein wasn't worried about being disturbed at all. This was because it wasn't that he was attempting to leave, but that Rionette Tynker had dispelled the historical void projection. This also meant that the operation at the other battlefield had succeeded. Chapter 1237 Distribution. As the golden rays of light shone down, Klarman, a Shaman King, who had lived for more than 1,000 years, collapsed into pieces at the entrance of the Evernight Cathedral. Every part of his body was charred black, completely drained of its blood. Amongst them, something fell out of his black robe ashes. It was a normal-sized palm. Its skin's texture didn't appear human at all, and it had a dim luster. Its fingers were slender with balanced amounts of flesh and bone. If he hadn't seen it on such an occasion, Emlyn definitely would have believed that the palm was a part of an exquisite doll. Another head in Rionette Tynker's hand swung forward as it quickly bit the palm. At the same time, Sharon's figure turned incorporeal as she entered the remains of Shaman King Klarman, speeding up the expelling of his Beyonder characteristic. Emlyn composed himself and looked at the door of summoning created by Lilith's ring. His body suddenly turned into a hazy moonlight. The crimson moonlight shattered into countless fragments of light. The bright and devilish red scales swam around the area enveloped by the moonlight, restructuring beside Klarman's corpse into Emlyn White in his tuxedo and bow tie. Without looking at the beyonder characteristic that had seeped out, he dispelled the unshadowed crucifix, bent down, and picked up the vision of White that he had previously thrown to the side using his black velvet glove. His other hand shook Lamino's travels as he flipped the book to one of the pages. The symbols and mysterious patterns on it all belonged to traveling. Emlyn's figure turned transparent as he vanished from the scene. He followed the plan and was the first to leave after the operation ended. He didn't interfere with Sharon and company's cleanup of the scene and their clearing of traces. After all, he was the weakest one there. He had used up a considerable amount of energy in battle while relying on the sealed artifacts and mystical items. As for the spoils of war, they would be distributed once they returned to Backlund. In this aspect, Emlyn fully believed in Gehrman Sparrow's promise and the Rose School of Thought's Temperance Department's credit. After teleporting back to an empty house in Backlund, he suddenly threw down Lamino's travels. He took out a bronze box with many red gems embedded in it, and he placed the vision of White inside. Only after doing this did Emlyn have the energy to take off the glove on his left hand. He saw that his fingers were filled with blisters, swollen. With the sanguine's regenerative ability, damage at such a level should have long been healed, but in reality, it hadn't improved at all. The burns brought by the vision of White will last at least 7 days. Emlyn took out ointment he had stored in a metal tube and squeezed out some of it to apply it on his wound. The soul-stabbing pain was immediately eased by the cooling sensation. Emlyn slowly exhaled as though he had finally resurrected. He had used a great deal of willpower to restrain himself from throwing the vision of White onto the ground. This was because once the sealed artifact left his control, it would automatically absorb the light around it and emit a radiant glow. To a sanguine, this was an excellent way of committing suicide. Right on the heels of that, Emlyn took out a bottle of his blood that he had extracted beforehand and smeared it on the surface of Lamino's travels. Then, he drank another bottle of blood to ease the bloodthirst that Lilith's ring brought about. After such an operation, he finally removed the negative effects the sealed artifact had on him. Only at this moment did Emlyn have the time to recall the accident that had happened during the battle. The door of summoning that he projected with Lilith's ring didn't summon creatures from deep in the spirit world, but he ended up summoning a strange moon. The moon hung behind the door of summoning and silently illuminated Shaman King Klarman, suppressing the various beyonder powers that belonged to the moon domain. If not for this change, even if Lilith's ring had summoned a saint-level spirit world creature, the battle wouldn't have ended so quickly. Perhaps they would have had to wait until the Rose School of Thought Temperance Angel descended to gain an overwhelming advantage. A silvery white moon. Could it be that the ancestor had provided me with some help? Emlyn had a thought and made a corresponding guess. This matched the identity of the sanguine savior that the ancestor had appointed. After careful consideration, Emlyn no longer had any doubts about this guess, but unlike the past, he wasn't that excited or thrilled. After experiencing a battle at the demigod level and confirming that he was shouldering such an important responsibility, he felt no sense of pride. His heart was heavy from the pressure. Phew. A few seconds later, Emlyn opened his mouth and whispered, "I'm the savior of the sanguine." When he said this, his expression was abnormally solemn, somewhat dignified, without any hesitation. In the house where Emlyn met Marek and Sharon, when the sanguine saw the perfect doll-like lady take out 2 items, he heard her slightly ethereal voice say, "According to the agreement, we will only take 1 thing. This is the rest." The 2 items were a fist-sized gem condensed from thick blood. It emitted a crimson glow, like a miniature crimson moon. The other item was an exquisite male doll with 2 black holes as its eyes. Shaman King's beyonder characteristic. General of the pupilless eye. Emlyn nodded and saw that the 2 items seemed to have a life of their own as they flew over. Just as he reached out to catch it, he heard Miss Sharon add, "The Shaman King beyonder characteristic has some strange traces of corruption. Even the unshadowed spear was unable to cleanse it. It means that I need to find an angel to help me shatter it to remove the corruption?" Emlyn completely understood what Sharon was saying as he nodded slightly. "I understand what to do." Sharon, who was wearing a small black bonnet, immediately floated up and gave a curtsy. "Thank you for your help." "Likewise." Emlyn took off his hat and bowed in return. Above the grayish-white fog, inside the ancient palace, Klein looked at the wisps of black gas emanating from his body, shook his head, and sighed. "I actually got cursed by the abomination without realizing it. The projection of the chained god could be the culprit as well. I was even separated by a historical projection. If it were any saint without Sapphira Castle, they would probably experience a sudden death after thinking they were safe. As for Miss Messenger, there wasn't much of a problem even without the historical projection in between because she was a real angel. Therefore, Klein wasn't worried. After the black gas dissipated, Klein waited for a while. He waited until Emlyn sacrificed the items and requested Mr. Fool to help purify the Shaman King Beyonder characteristic. Strange corruption. From the Mother Tree of Desire or the Primordial Moon? Klein picked up the miniature crimson moon and carefully observed it for a few seconds. During this process, he was on high alert, constantly preparing to mobilize Sapphira Castle's powers. If he wasn't at the level of an angel level here, he wouldn't have agreed to Emlyn's sacrifice. Instead, he would have chosen to smite down with power at the Sequence 2 level, shattering the characteristic and separating the corruption remotely. Back then, Klein didn't even dare to divine the werewolf Beyonder characteristic that had been slightly influenced by the Mother Tree of Desire. He had even hurriedly sold it. After examining it seriously, Klein pressed his right hand, causing the entire mysterious space to vibrate. The miniature crimson moon shattered with a crack, splitting into tiny red dots of light. Amongst these light dots, there was a small amount of red mist that evaporated, eventually forming a drop of fresh blood. Then, the red light dots gathered again, constantly condensing before transforming into the miniature crimson moon. However, compared to before, it was more translucent and pure. Klein conjured a fake hand, picked up the drop of seemingly fresh blood, and discovered that it contained immense vitality. It's not at the angel level, but it's a little strange. It seems to have received an evil god's blessings. As Klein cut off all the invisible connections that resulted from the blood, he took a paper figurine and attempted to press the drop of blood onto it. The moment the blood came into contact with the paper figurine, it immediately seeped in. In the next second, the paper figurine's stomach strangely bulged and exploded. At the moment the paper figurine tore apart, a new paper figurine with a hint of crimson crawled out from its stomach. It seemed to have fully developed features. The power of reproduction. Klein frowned slightly as he stabbed with his right hand, reducing the newly born paper figurine into powder. A tiny amount of blood-colored mist emanated again, condensing into a drop of blood. The characteristic and spirituality were only slightly weakened. It needs to be repeated more than 100 times before it can be completely removed. Klein silently assessed as he gathered the powers of Sapphira Castle to seal the drop of blood. He then looked up and cast his gaze at the male doll on the long mottled table. The palm-sized doll in a formal suit was prostrating. It didn't dare to look up. Oh, how easy is it to deal with those with living characteristics? Klein chuckled as he gathered the sealed drop of blood and brought it close towards the doll named General of the Pupilless Eye. General of the Pupilless Eye pushed itself up with all four limbs and quickly retreated. After a pause, it pressed its forehead against the table, emitting a sound indecipherable to humans. Declaring your subservience? Very good, Klein replied with a smile and casually instructed. Show me your abilities. After a series of demonstrations, he confirmed that General of the Pupilless Eye could possess a target and affect lifeless items. It also had some level of control over mystical items that no one possessed or had spirituality injected into. The latter power might be very useful at certain times. Klein nodded slightly and beckoned for it to jump into a box he conjured. After carefully sealing it, Klein threw the box and the drop of blood into the junk pile to let them familiarize themselves with their future lives. As for the negative effects of General of the Pupilless Eye, Klein believed that they could discuss and resolve it amicably and normally. Chapter 1238 Hypothesis. After dealing with the spoils of war and bestowing the purified Shaman King Beyonder characteristic to Emlyn White, Klein was in no hurry to leave Sapphira Castle. He simply reviewed the battle today. One thing he focused on was Abomination Sua's performance in various aspects, so as to assess how powerful an angel was. If I encounter him head-on and do not hold back, I might not even have a chance to summon an angel projection, unless I succeed on my first attempt. Of course, my target, Dark Demon Wolf, is a Sequence 2 Miracle Invoker. As for Abomination Sua, he is already a Sequence 1. The gap between the two is likely quite significant. However, Dark Demonic Wolf shares the same seer pathway as me. He suppresses me in every aspect. I can only be thankful that he hasn't completed the ritual and advanced to Sequence 1, or I wouldn't have any hope of winning. Sequence 1. As his thoughts raced, Klein's gaze suddenly constricted as he sat straight. He had thought of a possibility in a moment of inspiration. Could the dark demonic wolf, Kotor, have advanced and become a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries? He created a marionette city to mislead possible trackers, such as Angel of Time Amon? It can't be ruled out. Yes, there's another possibility. The dark demonic wolf Kotor is in complete control of that curtain, and has the strength of a quasi-Sequence 1. The more Klein thought about it, the more he realized that the operation was more dangerous than he imagined. The dark demonic wolf has survived in the forsaken land of the gods for so many years. Even a god of trickery like Amon is unable to capture him. This means that his strength and intelligence has reached a rather high level. I still have to make more preparations for hunting him. Klein frowned slightly and slowly exhaled. Backland, Westborough. Within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn sat on a leather sofa in the living room, crossed his right leg, and placed it on his left thigh, patiently waiting for Baron Cosmi to enter. Before long, the middle-aged sanguine Baron entered the living room and swept his gaze across Emlyn. "Viscount White, why are you visiting so late at night?" Emlyn smiled and said, "Isn't this just the beginning of a day? Look, the crimson moon outside the window is so beautiful." Cosmi wanted to retort to the young sanguine, pointing out how Emlyn followed the good practice of waking up at 7 in the morning and sleeping before 11 back when he went to the harvest church. After a moment of hesitation, he resisted the urge and said, "What's the matter?" Emlyn raised his hand to pat the gown, tugged at his bow tie, and slowly got up. He raised his chin slightly and said, "Tell Lord Nibs that he can begin preparing for the Earl conferment ritual." Cosmi instinctively asked, "What are you talking about?" Just as he said that, he suddenly came to a realization as he recalled Emlyn's previous application. "Why, you obtained an Earl? No, a Shaman King's Beyonder characteristic?" Emlyn enjoyed this very moment as he replied with a smile. "Did you think I was just joking when borrowing Vision of White?" As he spoke, he took out the bronze box inlaid with many ruby gems. He opened it and revealed the eyeball-shaped glass sphere inside, indicating that he hadn't lost it and was about to return it. Cosmi's eyes flickered as he said, "The Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction still has such powerful strength? Then why did they cooperate with you?" The upper echelons of the Sanguine in Backland, which was also the grandfather of Cosmi, Marquis Nibs Odora, didn't think highly of Emlyn's previous application. He wanted to wait for the cooperation with the Rose School of Thought to fall through before Emlyn had no choice but to seek help from him or their demigods. Emlyn glanced at him and replied with a smile, "It's a secret." This was the tone he learned from Gehrman Sparrow. He found it cool and thought that it suited his preferences. At the same time, this was the key point that the Hanged Man had repeatedly told him during the free exchange of the Tarot Club. Only by maintaining a sense of mystery would the upper echelons of the Sanguine experience certain fear. This prevented them from finding excuses or using their status to take away the Shaman King characteristic. Without waiting for Cosmi to respond, Emlyn threw the bronze box containing the Vision of White and buttoned up his suit. He walked past the Baron and walked to the door of the living room. As he was about to leave, Emlyn stopped. Without turning his head, he straightened his back and looked straight ahead. "Remember to address me as Earl next time." With the ancestors' blessings and the importance the moon had placed on him, he was filled with confidence in becoming a Shaman King. Cosmi's facial muscles twitched, but he maintained his silence. Only after Emlyn left did he find it difficult to control his warped expression. As a sanguine who had existed since the time of Roselle, he was many years older than Emlyn, but he remained a baron. He was just slightly better than those without a noble title. As for Emlyn, who was considered a laughingstock amongst the younger generation of the Backland Sanguine, he was about to cross the border separating mortals and gods. He would become a Sequence 4 Shaman King, a Sanguine Earl. How could Cosmi not lose his composure? How could he not be jealous? How could he not be shocked? After spending a few minutes to control his emotions, he headed down to the basement. Passing through several secret doors, he arrived at the grey hall where Nibs was sleeping. "Grandfather, Emlyn's operation has succeeded." Inside the black iron coffin, there was a brief silence. After 3 or 4 seconds, Nibs finally said, "The faction backing him is beyond our imagination." This sanguine Marquis's voice was deep and old, with a hint of hoarseness as it echoed in the hall. "Grandfather, Emlyn succeeded by relying on the Vision of White. A portion of the items he obtained rightfully belongs to the race," Cosmi said with some anticipation, feeling somewhat indignant. Nibs's voice grew louder. Buffoon. To be able to hunt a shaman king while the Rose School of Thought was clearly prepared. Is that something any faction can do? The Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction has been in shambles for years. So how much strength can it have left? At most, they have an angel in a poor condition, or a grade 0 sealed artifact, as well as 2 to 3 demigods. All these put together wouldn't be able to restrain Abomination Sua and the Rose School of Thought's other angels, other grade 0 sealed artifacts, a sizable number of demigods, as well as the Chained God's projection, and the blessings of the Mother Tree of Desire. If Emlyn's operation succeeded, then you can count how many angels and grade 0 sealed artifacts are needed at the very least. This is a power that can match ours. In the future, don't deliberately investigate Emlyn and his other companions. After shouting a few more times, Nibs coughed twice, clearly struggling. Cosme's face turned pale as he finally calmed down. Then, are you really going to prepare a ritual for him? What else? Nibs returned with a question before sighing. Perhaps after Emlyn took the risk for the Sanguine's future, the ancestor has truly begun showing her concern for him. Fog Sea, Lacha Island. After leaving the future on the safe sea route, Admiral of Stars Katlia used her fairy tale magic to arrive at a mountain peak. She recited a passage in Jotun to an empty cliff. Open sesame. A path immediately appeared on the cliff as though it was real and illusory. It was unknown where it led to. Katlia made use of her prophetic means to make a simple assessment of any danger. Then, she stepped onto the path and ventured deep into the cliff. As she walked, her vision cleared up. She saw the sea that appeared clear like sapphires and a beautiful castle made of pure emerald. This was Queen Mystic Bernadette's Emerald City. Katlia wasn't unfamiliar with this place. She easily passed the questions and tests of the magical guards and came to the half-open room that provided the best vista in the castle. The tall queen was standing behind the railing, looking at the waves that surged forward. For some reason, Katlia's hidden excitement, thrill, and joy suddenly calmed down at that moment as she felt a sense of security and freedom. Back when she cruised the seas, she would occasionally feel lonely and sad, like a leaf that had left its tree, allowing the wind to bring her to different places. Now, she seemed to have fallen back to the ground, right beside the tree. She opened her mouth, momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, she nudged the heavy glasses on her nose and simply greeted, "Good afternoon, Your Majesty." Bernadette turned around and nodded. "I summoned you back to Emerald City because I have some things to hand over to you." Katlia instinctively asked, "Why are you handing them over to me?" The Queen had a secret organization like Element Dawn and a group of pirates under her. Bernadette didn't directly answer Katlia's question as she said, "I previously received a clue and left Backlund in a hurry." "I remember the matter," Katlia interjected. Bernadette's long and straight eyebrows twitched slightly. "Through this clue, I managed to piece together an incomplete sea map from the descendants of Edwards, William, and Polly. It records the area my father had explored in the Fog Sea those years. With the help of this sea map and my prophetic abilities, I can roughly guess that a particular area out at sea that is far away from the safe sea route might be hiding his secret. I plan on heading there on the dawn to do an extended search. I'm not sure when I can return. Perhaps I will never be able to return. Therefore, I have to hand over some items and matters to you in advance." After listening carefully, Katlia said without hesitation, "I'll go with you. It is my father. This is something I have to do, alone." Queen Mystic Bernadette slowly shook her head. Katlia fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "If you don't return, I would do the same." Chapter 1239 Legacy. Upon hearing Katlia's words, Queen Mystic Bernadette looked at her silently for a few seconds before saying, "That is your choice, and also your freedom." Katlia stared straight at the Queen before pursing her lips and saying, "I know. You must have destroyed all the clues that will allow me to pursue your tracks. To you, this is to end the past. All of it, regardless of whether you return." The chestnut-colored hair casually draped over Bernadette's shoulders as she maintained her silence as if she was using this method to confirm the Admiral of Stars' guess. When Katlia saw this, she smiled bitterly and said, "I won't harp on how I'll do everything I can to find you if you were to remain lost for half a year or a year. I just want you to remember to recite Mr. Fool's honorific name when the danger is gravest." She said that title frankly. Queen Mystic Bernadette slowly nodded and said, "I will keep that in mind." Katlia immediately revealed a smile as she said with misty eyes, "What items and matters need to be handed over to me?" With a flip of her hand, Bernadette took out an item from somewhere. The item was entirely gold in color, like a miniaturized kettle. Its surface was covered with mysterious and complicated symbols, and a part of a lamp's wick extended out from the mouth. Its name is the Magic Wishing Lamp. Its serial number is 0-05. It might have originated from the first epoch, and even a true deity can't shatter it. Normally, it wouldn't cause any harm, nor would it be of any use. However, it will constantly tempt you to rub it through dreams and illusions, to summon the genie. Queen Mystic Bernadette simply introduced the item's origins and effects. The genie claims to be eternal and can grant you any 10 wishes, but often, they are fulfilled in an extremely warped manner or with terrifying consequences. My father told me that the holder can avoid the harm brought by the first 2 wishes through proper wording and preparations, but the 3rd wish is absolutely forbidden. At this point, Bernadette emphasized, absolutely forbidden. It sounds easy to get around it, Katlia thought for a moment before saying, can't you make 2 wishes before giving it to me? I'll make another 2 wishes, then give it to Frank, Heath, and the others. This will allow for many things to be done. She was only using Frank as an example. She had no intention of letting him come into contact with something so dangerous. Holding the magic wishing lamp, Bernadette shook her head indiscernibly and said, the owner is different from the wielder. Before I die, even if you obtain the magic wishing lamp, you will only be a wielder. The first wish you make will also be counted as my 3rd wish and your first wish. Also, although we can craft our words and make preparations to avoid the damage caused by the fulfillment of the wishes, this does not mean that the genie isn't intelligent. On the contrary, he is very smart, very cunning, and has a very strong sense of autonomy. Katlia tersely acknowledged. Then, is there any wish that he cannot fulfill? Nothing at the moment, but if it involves the level of a true deity, the distortion of the wish will exceed your imagination. To put it simply, if you wish to become a sequence 0 true deity, then your body and soul will meld into one with an unknown evil god. Remember, the genie's requirement is that the wish has to be simple and concise. Otherwise, he will reject it and treat it as if you have already made a wish, Bernadette explained. With that said, she got an invisible servant to fly towards Katlia with the terrifying sealed artifact 0-05. After Katlia reached out her hand to grab the magic wishing lamp, Bernadette continued, if you dream of the genie and are bewitched by him to make a wish, that means that I can no longer return. Following that, you will be its owner. I hope that your first wish is to retrieve all the items that were carried on Bernadette Gustav's person before she headed out to sea, including her own Beyonder characteristic. Yes, it's best to add the exact date when making a wish. Katlia looked down at the golden lamp and blurted out, can I make a wish to bring you back to life? After a few seconds of silence, Bernadette said, the resurrected me might just be a monster. If you really wish to do so, you can ask Mr. Fool for his opinion. Katlia nodded slightly. Okay, this is the item I'm giving you and the matters I need to settle. I'll leave the rest to the Element Dawn. They will have a new leader and won't collapse because of a person's disappearance. Bernadette didn't beat around the bush, indicating that this was the main reason she had summoned Katlia to Emerald City. The level of the divine lamp was extremely high, making it impossible to pass it through a messenger. Without waiting for Katlia's reply, Queen Mystic's expression suddenly softened. Haven't you always wanted to share what happened all these years with me? Katlia was taken aback as she nodded. That's right. She then walked to the Queen's side, pulled a chair over, and sat down, facing the blue sea beyond the emerald railing. Bernadette sat beside her and listened to her talk about all the encounters after she left the Dawn. These matters had been mentioned in the letter by Katlia, but due to the limited length, she didn't provide any detailed descriptions. There were some that she was sharing for the first time. At some point in time, Katlia fell asleep and dreamed of a time many years ago. At that time, she was just a maiden who stubbornly left the Dawn without looking back. Suddenly, she woke up and realized that there was no one beside her. She realized that it had already turned dark at some point in time, and dawn was even approaching. Katlia suddenly reached out and threw out an illusory ball of yarn. The ball of yarn rolled into the void, leaving behind a bright-colored thread. Following this thread, Katlia walked through the spirit world as though she had mastered teleportation, and arrived at the periphery of La Cha Island. She stood at the edge of the cliff and cast her gaze into the distance. She saw that on the dark blue sea, a gorgeous and huge sailboat, which was tinted with an orange glow, was steering towards the horizon. Katlia slowly sat down and leaned forward slightly. She hugged her knees and looked in that direction for a long time.
The sun gradually rose and shone on her.
In Backland, at a soup kitchen, the veil-wearing Stellan Sammer no longer lowered her head like the previous few months, afraid that others would recognize her. The only worry on her mind as she anxiously looked ahead was if the free food would last until it was her turn. She could vaguely hear gunshots echoing in the distance. She didn't know if the armies of Faysak, Intis, or Fainapotter had breached the final line of defense, or if the police were dealing with a looter. Please end it. Please end this war quickly. Stellan, who had gone to 3 soup kitchens, silently prayed. At this moment, a staff member raised his voice and said from a few meters away, "All the food here has been handed out." Stellan's face turned ashen.
She looked up at the dark sky and dragged her feet in despair and numbness before returning to the house at 17 Minsk Street.
The moment she opened the door, her 2 children rushed over and raised their innocent faces. "Mommy, did you get any bread?" "Mommy, I'm hungry." They were twins, a boy and a girl. Both of them were very adorable. Stellan held back her tears and forced a smile.
"Yes."
She then entered the house, took out some pieces of bread she had stashed, and split it among the 2 children. As she watched the 2 children eat the bread without any regard for etiquette, Stellan's expression kept changing. It cycled between sorrow and pain. Not long after, her husband Luke Sammer returned home, but he too didn't have any food in his hands. Ever since the Koim company was taken over by the military during the war, this former manager had lost his job. He could only rely on their past savings and maintain his family via government aid.
"I didn't manage to." Seeing his wife's hopeful gaze, this burly man with a messy beard lowered his head in shame.
Stellan, who still looked rather pretty while in her 30s, took a deep breath and said, "Me too. I'll go out and queue again. There should still be places that haven't finished distributing food." Without waiting for her husband to respond, she rushed out of the door. Luke immediately turned around and said to her back, "I'll find another one too." Stellan didn't stop. She walked 2 streets and arrived in front of a house with a garden. Not long after, she saw the owner of the place, a tycoon in his 50s. "I want to buy some food." Stellan took out a stack of crumpled bills.
The grizzled elder smiled and said, "And why should I sell it to you?"
"I remember that you rejected me last time." Stellan's face paled. Without a word, she lowered her head and unbuckled her belt with her other hand.
With a snap, the leather belt that was originally very exquisite but now had quite a few stains fell to the ground.
Luke Sammer wandered aimlessly on the streets, unsure where he could find food.
Looking at the small number of pedestrians passing by, and the bags that they were trying their best to protect, the scholarly gentleman's eyes gradually turned red.
Unknowingly, he followed someone and turned into a street. In less than an hour, the curfew would begin. This was a rare opportunity for him. That person stopped outside a house and walked towards the door feebly. At this moment, the person suddenly fainted and fell to the ground. Luke subconsciously took a few steps back before quickly approaching to test the pedestrian's breathing. His gaze unconsciously fell on the paper bag in the man's embrace, and he could smell the aroma of bread. Luke gulped and reached out for the bag.
As he moved his hand, he looked back in fear at the house that this pedestrian was trying to enter.
He saw a child's drawing pasted on the oriel window. Luke's actions stiffened. A few seconds later, he stood up, walked to the door of the house, and rang the doorbell. The house's mistress and child quickly opened the door and saw their weak father and the bag of bread. The curfew arrived very quickly, and Luke returned to Minsk Street dejectedly. Just as he opened the door, he saw his wife smiling at him. "I got food." "That's great." Luke heaved a sigh of relief and hugged her tightly. Audrey walked along the streets and alleys, with no one capable of seeing her. She didn't say anything and walked back to Empress Borough, all the way back into the luxurious mansion where she smelled the aroma of pan-fried foie gras and other delicacies. After staring silently for a while, she saw the maids coming and going. Finally, she headed upstairs to her room. In the middle of the night, she wore a cloak and entered her parents' bedroom before arriving at their bed. After staring at them for a long time, Audrey knelt down on one knee and pressed her forehead against her father's hand. Beads of water dripped onto the carpet. Then the blonde, green-eyed noble lady slowly raised her head and said to her sleeping parents, choking, "Daddy, Mommy, thank you. Thank you for teaching me what pity, kindness, and virtue are." As soon as she finished speaking, she closed her eyes and stood up abruptly. Turning around, she walked towards the door, no longer wearing the slightest emotions on her face. Chapter 1240. The tide. In the early morning, Earl Hall woke up at his usual time and took a stroll in his garden and lawn. By the time he finished looking at his beloved thoroughbreds, he returned to the third floor of the villa and changed out of his outing clothes.
His wife, Caitlin, had already woken up and was instructing her lady's maid to relay her thoughts to the rest of the servants.
It's time for breakfast. Earl Hall stood beside the coat rack and smiled at his wife. At that moment, he heard a commotion outside, one that was getting closer and closer, but it did not quell.
With a slight frown, Earl Hall turned his head to look at his valet. Without needing the noble to speak, the valet immediately walked to the window and drew open the thin curtain.
With a swoosh, more light shone into the bedroom. It was clear.
The valet then cast his gaze out the window and scanned his surroundings. His expression suddenly became solemn. He turned around and glanced at Lady Caitlin, who was still talking to the lady's maid. He walked quickly to Earl Hall's side and said in a low voice, "A protest.
Many people are protesting." A protest? Earl Hall was no stranger to this term. As a powerful Lone Kingdom noble, and the second-largest shareholder of the Constant Coal and Steel Consortium, he had seen many workers protest in demonstrations, requesting for a rise in their weekly salaries, as well as stipulate for maximum working hours. During the past 2 months, Backlund had also undergone several protests due to various problems, but they were quickly suppressed without causing too much of an impact. His gaze moved back and forth across his valet's face for a few seconds. Eyes narrowed, he acutely sensed that the protest today might be different from what he had imagined.
Without batting an eyelid, he walked to the window.
Looking out, Earl Hall's eyes suddenly froze.
With the advantage of being on the third floor, he saw that the roads were filled with dense hordes of people, extending far into the distance. They gathered together and surged in this direction, as if they were a dark, gigantic cloud that was about to envelop Backlund.
"Bread!
We want bread!"
The shouts of tens of thousands of people, and even more people, grew into a crescendo, one that was loud and clear. It made Earl Hall's scalp tingle. Having participated in the mass at Festival Square, he was no stranger to seeing large masses of people or hearing people booming in one voice. But back then, he could barely be considered a part of the crowd. And today, he was one of the targets of the surging tidal wave. Earl Hall couldn't help but glance towards the end of the protesters, only to realize that there was no end to it. However, with his rich experience in handling matters, he could make a judgment based on the details he had observed. He could see that there were very few police and soldiers on both sides of the protesters. Compared to the large number of people, they were like the eddies created by a tidal wave, a negligible detail. Earl Hall believed that the protesters that targeted Empress Borough would definitely be clamped down upon with the greatest force possible. It would be impossible for large numbers of soldiers and police to be deployed. The current situation could only mean one thing. There were too many people participating in the protest. As such, the soldiers and police were spread too thin. A protest numbering more than 100,000 people? Perhaps more. A protest arising from a food shortage can turn into a riot and looting at any time. It might still seem orderly now. Because there are many organizers and leaders? Damn it. Didn't MI9 and the various churches notice any signs? How could such a large-scale protest be organized overnight? Even if Backlund has become a gunpowder keg, it would still require quite a number of matchsticks to light it. Thoughts ran through Earl Hall's mind as his expression grew graver. Bread! We want bread! The shouting became louder and more uniform, as if there was a tsunami in the city. At that moment, the servants in Earl Hall's mansion sensed the commotion. All of them went to the windows and looked beyond the compound gates. Their faces turned pale, as though they had encountered a flood that could not be avoided. Bread! We want bread! Countless voices converged together, as the dense masses exuded a suffocating presence. Earl Hall snapped to his senses. He subconsciously wanted to get someone to send a telegram to the royal family to get them to organize an army to suppress the protesters. However, after further observation, he realized that quite a number of protesters were wearing military uniforms and were disabled. Bread! We want bread! The soldiers in charge of maintaining order looked at the protesters with pity and pointed their guns at the sky. Among those people were their old comrades, their parents and children, their friends, neighbors, and large numbers of people who simply desired the same right to live like them. They just didn't want to starve to death. How could they not feel pity and empathy? At first, Such feelings might have arisen in a handful of soldiers and police, but it quickly spread to almost everyone. In the past, under their officers' supervision at gunpoint, they would have accepted all orders without any protest. But now, many people were thinking, any son of a bitch who dares to get me to fire shall be fired upon. Bread. We want bread. From the shouts and the impact of the huge crowd, the color in Earl Hall's face drained. He couldn't help but retract his gaze and look at the guards and bodyguards gathered outside the house. He looked at the beyonders of the Church of Evernight who were responsible for protecting his family, and he realized that the reactions of the two were different. The guards and bodyguards were filled with fear. The expressions of the secretly hired beyonders had already become rather solemn. As for the protectors from the Church of Evernight, their gazes were filled with pity and empathy. To the Church, I might be equivalent to 1,000 believers, but there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even more. Earl Hall instantly came to a realization of the consequences of what he had planned to do. Even though they were armed to the teeth, there was no way they could fend off so many protesters with just a few bodyguards. Once the conflict erupted, the beyonders of the Church of Evernight couldn't be counted on at all. It was already a blessing by the goddess if his family could escape Empress Burrow with the bodyguards he hired. For the first time, Earl Hall experienced the strength of the masses. He experienced the terror of the unity of people. As this thought flashed through his mind, he immediately turned his head and instructed his valet, "Send a telegram to the Prime Minister and send a telegram to the other nobles. Say that I'm willing to take the lead and donate most of our food. Get them to remain calm." As the radio signals exchanged across the air, the nobles living in Empress Burrow all learned of his attitude. The present Duke Negan looked out the window with a serious expression. After a moment of silence, he exhaled and said to the male secretary beside him, "Protect the mansion and give up any forceful stance. Follow Earl Hall's lead. Also, make the merchants who are hoarding food the first examples." By the time the upper-class society came to a consensus and came up with a solution, Earl Hall's heart finally settled back to its original position. He had the energy to head to the dining room to meet his family. When he passed through the dining hall's entrance, he subconsciously scanned the situation inside. His wife stood by the window, looking out the window with worry. His eldest son kept pacing back and forth, appearing very angry and anxious. His daughter stood beside his wife, watching the tidal wave-like protesters in silence. Fog Sea. Future. Katlia stepped on a resplendent bridge formed from starlight and returned to the deck. "Captain, you have to do something about Frank this time." Bosun Nina rushed over and shouted. Katlia's depressed and sorrowful mood was instantly shattered as she frowned slightly. "What did he do again?" Nina said angrily. "He asked me if I knew how to have children. He wants to study how life is born and how the soul is created." "Did you hit him?" Katlia fell silent for a second. "I did." Nina didn't hide anything. Katlia then looked at Frank, who was not far away, ignoring his bruised face. "You should first study how fish breed." "All right." Frank scratched his head and heeded his captain's orders. Following that, Katlia nodded at the shadow which extended out from the cabin, the pale-faced bloodless Heath Doyle. "Everything's fine now." Heath Doyle clearly relaxed. "Yes, Captain." After this farce with her crew, Katlia finally returned to the real world. While they weren't paying attention, she rubbed her temples and flew into the captain's cabin. Following that, she sealed the cabin with magic and took out the Grade 0 sealed artifact, Magic Wishing Lamp. After finishing her preparations, Katlia sat at her desk and lowered her head. She used Jotun to recite Mr. Fool's honorific name to report to him about Queen Mystic. Holding a lantern in hand, Klein surveyed the surrounding area of the northern city ruins. He turned his head slightly and listened for a few seconds before following the process of entering the world above the gray fog. He then sat on the high-backed chair belonging to the fool at the end of the long mottled table, spreading his spirituality towards the crimson star representing the hermit. Queen Mystic has some preliminary clues to the primitive island. She plans on leaving the safe sea route to do an extended search. That primitive island was discovered by Emperor Roselle by chance. It's very likely that one of his 9 secret mausoleums is hidden on it. This is the only one that hasn't been discovered and destroyed at the moment. It's the hope of the Emperor's resurrection. However, the living beings on that primitive island seem to worship an unknown power that comes from the cosmos. Just understanding the cosmos that will lead to corruption. I need to remind Ma'am Hermit to warn Queen Mystic. Magic Wishing Lamp. Magic Wishing Lamp? So this Grade 0 sealed artifact is in the hands of Queen Mystic. It's a combination of a Miracle Invoker's Beyonder characteristic and a characteristic of unknown origins. Even a true deity can't shatter it. Just as he finished listening to 0-05's description, he immediately adjusted his vision and enlarged the scene of the golden kettle-like magic wishing lamp. Suddenly, the wick at the mouth of the magic wishing lamp lit up. Chapter 1241 Genie. The light emitted by the lamp's core was extremely viscous, like water that had been infused with quite a bit of sugar. It spewed out, forming a distorted and blurry golden figure. This figure instantly occupied the crimson star representing the hermit, cutting off his ability to sense Catlia. Sitting at the end of the long bronze table, Klein's eyes widened as a thought subconsciously flashed across his mind, as expected of a sealed artifact labeled 0-05. Although the serial number of Grade 0 sealed artifacts was usually based on the order of the time the Orthodox churches obtained or understood them, it had to be known that this set of rules was officially established after the 7 churches truly ruled over the world, which was the late 4th epoch and early 5th epoch. Back then, most Grade 0 sealed artifacts had already appeared, and they had been learned of or obtained by the Orthodox churches. This resulted in a situation where the ones with smaller serial numbers being Grade 0 sealed artifacts that were more powerful, terrifying, and unimaginable. Then, the rest were labeled based on the order of appearance. In addition, although it wasn't wrong to say that an item was more powerful the more ancient it was, for an item from the first epoch that the ancient gods were unable to affect, it definitely meant that even deities didn't fully comprehend their secrets. This way, the smaller the number was, the more terrifying the Grade 0 sealed artifact was. Of course, based on this rule, the Grade 0 sealed artifacts with higher serial numbers weren't necessarily worse than the first 10. Perhaps it was simply because they were discovered or obtained by the church at a later date. Without any numbers left for them, they could only be serialized. Just as a thought flashed through his mind, the golden figure's gaze pierced through the crimson star representing the hermit and towards the ancient palace above the grey fog. Following that, his voice echoed in an unusually magnificent manner. "Long time no see." Long time no see? Long time no see. He knows the former owner of Sapphira Castle, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings? No, it should be him, a genie who claims to be eternal. He can actually use Ma'am Hermit's prayer to directly talk to me. A thought flashed through Klein's mind as he tensed up. Based on his experience over the recent years, as well as his ability as a clown, his body suddenly relaxed and he leisurely leaned back into his chair. Following that, Klein replied, "Heh." He didn't give an affirmative answer, nor did he deny that he was a fake. He only showed a look of contempt and wore a supercilious look. The blurry golden figure harumphed. "You've actually been weakened so much. It's no wonder that I haven't heard of your honorific name in the past few millennia." Honorific name? He really knows the former owner of Sapphira Castle. Is that an existence who was active during the first epoch? Amidst his thoughts, Klein smiled and said, "What you see might not be the truth." "Ha ha." The twisted and blurry golden figure laughed and said, "You're still your usual self, always trying to scam others, but the condition of Sapphira Castle cannot fool me. Under normal circumstances, there's no way for me to pass through the outer layers of protection to communicate with you." "How do you know that I didn't do it on purpose?" Klein asked in a relaxed manner. "There's no point in lying to me," the distorted blurry golden genie immediately replied. "Why do I feel like the victim of fraud is saying that I'm penniless, to the point of having sold my kidney?" Back then, what did the previous owner of Sapphira Castle, the one suspected to be the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, do to the genie? Part of the characteristics of this magic wishing lamp is that of a miracle invoker. Using his lampooning to relieve the pressure in his heart, Klein smiled. "It's not up to you to decide whether there's any point." The blurry golden figure trembled slightly. "From the state of Sapphira Castle, you seem to have a need for a miracle invoker beyonder characteristic." He did not harp on the topic and instead pointed out the situation he had observed. "This fellow can actually see through this matter. His level is really very high. He is able to separate the miracle invoker beyonder characteristic from the magic wishing lamp?" Klein's eyes narrowed as he nearly lost his composure. He immediately controlled his actions and expression and replied with a smile, "If you think so." The blurry and distorted golden figure once again made his magnificent voice echo above the grey fog. "We can make a deal. You will remove my seal and give me freedom." I will leave the miracle invoker beyonder characteristic to you, and only take away the portion that belongs to me. As for a witness, let's use our spherote. Although both you and I have means to resist the backlash and reduce the damage caused by breaching the contract, it won't be without a price. We both need to consider the consequences.
I promise I won't stay here any longer than necessary.
Sealed. Spherote. The terrifying nature of the magic wishing lamp is a seal of an existence that's at least at the true deity level? With a thought, Klein quickly analyzed the viability of the matter. Soon he made a decision. He was not to be bewitched. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, he wasn't the real owner of Sapphira Castle. There was a limit to what he could do and handle. Secondly, he had received some mysticism education and had gleaned experiences as a nighthawk. He knew not to trade with unknown existences or bear any hope in being lucky. Having made up his mind, he calmed down and focused on how to gather more information. The genie was suspected to originate from the darkest, most chaotic, and most mysterious first epoch, so he definitely knew a lot. After some thought, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up. Do you think such conditions can move me?
He planned to see how high the chips the genie could offer, so as to pry into certain of his secrets. Upon hearing this, the flickering golden figure's eyes suddenly lit up in a literal manner. His gaze seemed to land directly on Klein as his magnificent voice quaked the ancient palace like thunder. You are not him.
You are not him. At that moment, Klein was a little stunned and also a little frightened. It was as if he was performing a grand magic show only to have a member of the audience suddenly point out his trick. He didn't know what was wrong with his rhetorical question, nor did he know what exactly was wrong. It was difficult for him to analyze the pros and cons in a short period of time, and give a reaction that matched the current situation. Why did he suddenly realize that I'm not the former owner of Sapphira Castle, the suspected celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings? Isn't my rhetoric question very reasonable? Since we're talking about a deal, bargaining should be allowed. The former owner of Sapphira Castle that the genie knew wasn't like that? Impossible. Why would a person who's good at deceit show his hand so readily? How can there not be some level of negotiation and pressure? Shit, too many thoughts are running through my mind. Nearly 10 seconds have passed. I didn't immediately answer the genie's accusation, so it's a form of indirect admittance. When it came to being exposed, Klein didn't have much experience. He was momentarily unsure for a response. Just as he raised his vigilance and was about to produce the Staff of the Stars and activate Sapphira Castle's powers to resist the possible attack from the genie, the golden and blurry figure suddenly laughed. Ha ha, ha ha, ha. This laughter seemed to stir his soul, causing Klein, who was inside Sapphira Castle, to nearly show signs of losing control. It wasn't easy for him to remain calm. There's no intention to attack, but the influence of natural dissipation. What's the genie laughing about? What's so funny? Klein frowned as he thought of one possibility after another, but he felt that they didn't match reality. After a few seconds, the genie's laughter stopped and he happily quipped, even for existences at our level, fate is still so miraculous. Regardless of who you are, the deal I proposed is still on the table. As long as you remove the seal and release me, I will return to the cosmos with the portion that belongs to me. As for the rest, I will leave the miracle invoker beyonder characteristic to you. In addition, I will grant you 3 wishes. How's that? Isn't that enough? Cosmos. When Klein heard that, his eyelids twitched as he sharply sensed danger. This was a warning from his spiritual intuition. He had originally thought that he could pretend to agree and obtain more information before using Sapphira Castle to go back on his promise, but now he suddenly felt that he could not make the promise. Hence, Klein decisively said, leave. As he spoke, he cut off the connection between himself and the crimson star representing the hermit. The blurry and distorted golden figure suddenly expanded and dissipated, leaving only his voice echoing. You will eventually agree. Only when the world above the gray fog had its calm completely restored did Klein slowly let out a breath and silently mutter to himself, the genie is a powerful creature from the cosmos. Was it sealed within the magical wishing lamp in the first epoch or earlier? The person who sealed him might be the previous owner of Sapphira Castle, the existence suspected to be the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. This can be inferred from the ingredients used to form the magic wishing lamp's beyonder characteristics. So, that's how the genie sensed that I wasn't the previous owner of Sapphira Castle when he questioned me? But I did consider this point, So my question wasn't logically unsound.
Unless, back then, the former owner of Sapphira Castle and the genie had come to some sort of tacit understanding or had some secret.
The bulk of the genie's powers likely can't extend out of the seal, but he can use the beyonder characteristic that forms the seal. The unique characteristic of granting wishes is likely from the miracle invoker characteristic. Then, the genie uses his level to magnify it. Amidst his thoughts, Klein raised his head to look at the crimson star representing the hermit. He discovered that Katlia didn't notice anything unusual with the magic wishing lamp. Phew! Klein formed a stream of light that contained his warnings and threw it into the crimson star. Chapter 1242 The Baffling Actions of the Human. The primitive island that the Emperor found by chance. The creatures on the island worship an unknown power that comes from the cosmos. Without reaching the level of an angel, just knowledge of it will result in corruption from the cosmos. Try not to make a wish to the genie, nor bring it to that primitive island. Katlia finally received feedback from Mr. Fool as she heaved a sigh of relief, even more worried about the Queen's quest. She turned her head to look at the unresponsive magic wishing lamp and quickly put it away. Then she spread out a letter, picked up a fountain pen, and paraphrased the information she had just received, hoping that Queen Mystic Bernadette would take it seriously. In a dilapidated apartment in Backlund, a man with a full beard was sitting on a chair with his hands cuffed behind him. Zio, who had become a middle-ranking MI9 member through her own capabilities, stood in front of the man, with a triangular blade in hand and her two subordinates flanking her. We already have enough witnesses and evidence to prove that you're one of the main organizers of the protest. If you wish to reduce your punishment, answer my questions honestly. Before Zio could say a word, the bearded man felt an extremely powerful suppressive force. When she finished speaking, even his mind began to tremble. It was as though bolts of electricity were generated and a pain and numbness that couldn't be perceived could explode at any moment. The bearded man suppressed the fear and weakness in his heart and said, "No one instigated me. I just did what I wanted to do. Don't you all know? The entirety of Backlund has become a gunpowder keg. Even a tiny spark can set off the entire city. And there are countless sparks like me who are willing to take the risk. Those darn nobles and merchants hoarded so much food while there are already people in Eastborough who are starving to death. You can do whatever you want to do to me. I've never believed in their promises. The reason why we agreed to end the protest was because everyone had received a lot of food."
Zio was about to ask further when she suddenly turned her head to listen to the commotion in the distance.
Sounds of rumbling could be heard from somewhere. It was deep, hoarse, and layered. Has the Faysac, Intis, or Fainapotter army broken through our defenses and begun to attack Backlund's defenses? Zio's expression instantly turned solemn. Back in the forsaken land of the gods, after Klein returned to the real world, he immediately attempted to reach out his hand to see if he could pull out the magic wishing lamp from the fog of history. Soon, he confirmed that he couldn't summon sealed artifact 0-05. Indeed, it involves a uniqueness, or should I say Sapphira? In short, the genie is indeed a high-ranking existence that was sealed. At the very least, he is a king of angels. There's no way to make use of him. Klein let out a breath and turned his attention back to the hunt of dark demonic wolf Kotar.
He had made a lot of preparations during this period of time, and he ran through and confirmed the plan above the grey fog.
However, he was in no hurry to take action. He spent quite a bit of time checking the loopholes and mending the imperfections. 2 to 3 days later, it was dark and silent in the wilderness. Wearing a silk top hat and a long black trench coat, Klein held a lantern that emitted a faint yellow glow.
With a solemn expression, he reached out his right hand and grabbed at the air.
At that moment, a bolt of lightning streaked across the world, illuminating it. Following that, he dragged out a figure. It was him holding the illusory staff of the stars and a lantern. Right on the heels of that, his true body entered the fog of history as he dashed to a time before the first epoch. He hid inside the old stacked cities. His historical void projection suddenly came alive as an area that he had been exploring recently had surfaced in his mind. He used the power of the Staff of the Stars to directly move to it. This was a huge distance away from where his actual body was.
Even if there was a problem with the projection, no one would be able to lock onto the exact location of where his true body was when he returned to reality.
Surveying the area, he took in the dried riverbed and a boulder that stood deep in the darkness like a monster.
He no longer maintained his Staff of the Stars historical projection, letting it quickly fade away and disappear with a shake of his right hand. After doing all of this, he walked to the boulder, put down the lantern, and began chanting an honorific name in Jotun, the dark lord that exists alongside history, the embodiment of countless miracles, the god of wishes. This was the dark demonic wolf's honorific name that he had obtained from the Evernight goddess. Although the mythical creature might not be using it anymore, or had perhaps changed it a long time ago, it was undoubtedly referring to him when it came to mysticism. Deep within a mountain range, in an ancient castle, giants, elves, humans, and vampires each held the role as gardeners, chefs, servants, and guards. They all had different expressions and would whisper to each other when they met, making them appear lively and intelligent. However, once they returned to their rooms, they would immediately turn dull. Their eyes would no longer move as their bodies floated up and hung from the ceiling. In the depths of the castle, in a hall where only lightning could light it up from outside the window, a huge figure lay quietly in the darkness. Its body was like a tiny mountain that was covered in dark short fur. Its pitch-black pupils covered at least 3/4 of its eyes, and at its forehead was a tuft of grayish-white fur. Its head resembled a magnified, twisted feral wolf. This was none other than the god of wishes, dark demonic wolf Kotur. Suddenly, this demonic wolf, which was more exaggerated than an ordinary giant, raised his head. Every strand of his dark and short hair began to sway as all the servants in the castle followed his actions. Kotur's eyes moved slightly as he turned his head slightly, as though he was listening to something. In the next second, he opened his mouth and let out a soundless roar and summoned another hymn. As soon as this dark demonic wolf appeared, Kotur's body leaped into the grayish-white fog as he dashed to a certain historical spot of light in the second epoch. This was a piece of secret history that he knew. In the real world, the dark demonic wolf's historical void projection made a wish in a tongue-twisting language. Then, with a flash of his figure, he directly moved to a mountain near the northern city of Noise. After making the necessary preparations, the god of wishes allowed a strand of dark short hair to fall off, turning into an illusory worm of spirit that expanded into the corresponding prayer point of light. With its help, Kotur saw who was praying to him. It was a young man wearing a strange hat and strange clothes. He stood beside a glass lantern and softly chanted the honorific name of the god of wishes. The dark demonic wolf's huge, pitch-black pupils turned and saw that the young man was covered in a layer of grayish-white fog. There were some things that could not be seen clearly in the fog. As a Sequence 2 angel of the seer pathway, this mythical creature could clearly sense that the fog was similar to the fog of history. It could sense a strong attraction force from something in the fog. Sapphira Castle? Having heard some matters from the ancient god, Flegria, the king of demonic wolves, he instantly had a guess. Under this premise, he had many thoughts regarding the young man. Using Sapphira Castle to attract me and make me attack him on my own accord, and then confirming my location? This is a bait? Indeed. He's just a historical void projection. It's unknown which time fragment his true body is hiding in. It's unknown where the ambusher is hiding. Previously, Sapphira Castle clearly had an anomaly. I controlled myself and didn't attempt to search for the corresponding region or the clues that might be left behind. Why do they think I will fall for it? It's just an attempt, switching to another when it doesn't work? Or is there something wrong with this prayer? I've lived for thousands of years. After experiencing so many things, what kind of situation have I not seen? The best solution now is to ignore him and not spy on him. I'll just remember him. The dark demonic wolf quickly made a decision and planned to observe for a while longer before destroying that prayer point of light. At this moment, Hebe saw the young man open his mouth again. The sun that is eternal. You are an inextinguishable light. You are the embodiment of order. The dark demonic wolf was somewhat puzzled as to what the young man was trying to do. In this forsaken land, praying to the other true deities was useless. In the next second, Klein once again chanted another deity's name. The Lord that created everything. The Lord who reigns behind the curtain of shadows, the degenerated nature of all living things. The dark demonic wolf's pupils dilated slightly. He was confused by the actions of the human in the prayer light. Before he could make any guesses, Klein muttered the third honorific name, the clock hand that tampers with time, the shadow that roams across fate, the embodiment of deceit and trickery. He is praying to Amon. The dark demonic wolf was already completely at a loss as to what the other party was up to. He instinctively felt that something was amiss and immediately wanted to wipe away the corresponding prayer point of light. Suddenly he saw the young man lift his head and smile.
He then took out a crystal monocle and put it on his right eye. In just one prayer, Klein's historical void projection had turned into blasphemer Amon's avatar. Almost at the same time, the dark demonic wolf felt the other party's gaze pass through the prayer light and land on him. Then, Amon looked past him, and into the fog of history where his true body was. Without any hesitation, he immediately destroyed the prayer light. As for his true body, he dispelled the gaze and removed the maintenance of the historical projection. In the fog of history, in the stacked city of old, Klein suddenly stood up. A scene surfaced in his mind. A few seconds before this scene took shape, he had severed the connection between his body and the historical void projection, doing so in order to avoid having Amon descent right beside him. The baffling actions that he had previously done were mainly to confuse the dark demonic wolf. He wanted him to continue observing after realizing that the supplicant wasn't the true body. This made him increase the time he spied on Sapphira Castle. In the end, he prayed to Amon, using the possible descent and influence of the god of deceit to hide the tracks of Sapphira Castle's reverse corruption of the dark demonic wolf. If Amon hadn't responded and merely watched by the sidelines, Klein would use the monocle he had prepared to deceive the dark demonic wolf. Chapter 1243 Hectic but not confused deep within a mountain range, in the ancient castle. As soon as dark demonic wolf Kotor returned from the fog of history, he instinctively removed all connections with the outside world. He was prepared to abandon this place and move elsewhere. Although he still hadn't figured out what had happened, with an accident already happening, his experience told him that he couldn't take any chances at all. He should retreat and give up as required of him. At the same time, a thought came to Klein's mind in the city of old. His figure instantly appeared in the ancient palace above the gray fog. At the seat belonging to the fool, he merged with the constantly distorted and scattered crimson figure and took form. In this mysterious space, the crimson stars that represented justice, the hanged man, the star, and the other members of the tarot club were constantly expanding and shrinking. They emitted layers of ripples that formed a mighty wave. This was one of the preparations that Klein had made in advance. In the name of Gehrman Sparrow, he had used different reasons to get the members of the tarot club to pray to Mr. Fool one after another, asking this existence to pass a certain answer to Mr. World. As such, the crimson stars resonated, affecting Sapphira Castle in reverse, thus allowing it to summon the fool to resolve the problem. This was one of the key factors that could help him escape from Amon's clutches. It could help him remove the need to take 4 steps counterclockwise and recite the incantations. He could directly enter Sapphira Castle without wasting any time. And in a battle at the level of angels, the difference a second makes would perhaps determine the difference in the outcome. To fight someone more powerful than him, Klein had to consider every detail. Sitting in the high-backed chair belonging to the fool, he beckoned for the staff of the stars and sea god's scepter while observing the other changes in Sapphira Castle. In the grayish-white fog, there was an additional crimson glow that was rapidly shrinking, almost disappearing in no time. Around the fool's seat, ripples of light bloomed as though they were forming a pure passageway. He could barely make out a gigantic demonic wolf's figure from the crimson glow. This was a result of Kotor's spying on Sapphira Castle. Through the passage of time, he had gained a certain understanding of the situation and had unknowingly been invaded. As such, he established a preliminary connection with Sapphira Castle. Of course, as an angel and a god of wishes of the second epoch, he had the right level and ability to sever such a connection and get rid of the corresponding corruption. If Klein didn't make use of these 1 or 2 seconds, he would lose his lock on the dark demonic wolf. And at the side of the fool's seat, the rippling lights reflected the figure wearing a half-top hat and a long black trench coat, Gehrman Sparrow. On his right eye was a crystal monocle. Amon. It was unknown what loophole this blasphemer's avatar could use to slow down the rate at which Klein's historical void projection dissipated. Then he used the subtle connection between Gehrman Sparrow, Klein's actual body, and Sapphira Castle in an attempt to invade the world above the gray fog from the special scene summoned by Sapphira Castle. As the halo spread out, Gehrman Sparrow's long and powerful palm pierced through the barrier and suddenly entered the ancient palace, as though it had opened an invisible door. Although Klein had already prepared for this and knew that it wouldn't be easy to get rid of Amon, he couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle when he saw this scene. He was afraid that in the next second, he would grab a crystal monocle and put it on his right eye. This was something that had to be resolved in 1 or 2 seconds. Otherwise, the ownership of Sapphira Castle would be a question left in the air. Without any hesitation, distorted and transparent worms of spirit appeared on the surface of his skin. They quickly gathered together, forming another Klein. After catching the sea god's scepter, Klein stirred the power of Sapphira Castle. With the augmentation of the layers of invisible waves, the blue gems lit up, causing violent bolts of lightning to form silver balls that rolled into the rippling light. Amidst the crackling sounds, the palm that pierced through Sapphira Castle instantly shattered and evaporated. The spherical lightning that was filled with destructive aura expanded outwards, descending into reality, enveloping the monocled Gehrman sparrow. This historical void projection was only barely maintained with the use of loopholes, so it collapsed after suffering such a strike. He could only adjust the crystal monocle and shake his head in regret as he watched his figure rapidly fade away after being shattered by the electric bolts. As a small portion of the worms of spirit responded to Amon's prayer, Klein grabbed the staff of the stars with his actual body. He held the staff embedded with many gems and aimed the Grade 0 sealed artifact at the rapidly shrinking crimson light. At the same time, a scene appeared in his mind. The rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and pearls on the staff of the stars lit up one after another. Gong! The sound of a distant bell seemed to have transcended an infinite amount of time as it echoed within the grayish-white fog, reverberating within the crimson light. The pitch-black darkness in front of dark demonic wolf Kotor suddenly faded, revealing a huge stone wall clock. The wall clock was ancient and mottled, and its surface was grayish-white and bluish-black, split into 12 segments. Each segment had different symbols that represented the different times of the day. At the core of the wall clock, 3 needles seemed to be formed from worms of time of 3 different lengths, short, medium, and long, were filled with a feeling that time had left its mark on. This was a beyonder power from Angel of Time, Amon. Using the Staff of the Stars, Klein had made it appear again. Normally speaking, a beyonder power at this level wasn't something that could be understood by just witnessing once or twice. It wasn't so easy to record it, but Klein wasn't fighting alone. During this period of time, he had made use of Miss Magician's summoning to return to Backlund frequently. He went to the Star Leonard to chat directly with Palez Zoroast, and he gained a deeper understanding of the corresponding mysticism knowledge and supernatural details. Although Palez had already dropped to the Sequence 2 level and was unable to use the powers of the time domain, his experience and knowledge remained. Gong! On the ancient and mysterious stone wall clock, the second hand suddenly jerked, causing everything around dark demonic wolf Kotor to slow down. Even the deep darkness seemed to freeze. This miracle invoker, who was just about to completely cut off contact with the outside world and distance himself from where he was by granting his own wish, suddenly froze on the spot. There was a brief moment of him being fixed in place. There was no doubt that there was a huge gap in power between the original Beyonder powers and those replicated by the Staff of the Stars. However, for Klein the effect was already enough. The moment he saw the dark demonic wolf being affected by the ancient wall clock, he immediately dropped the Staff of the Stars and made the worm of spirit he had just separated from his body to fly back into his body. With a thought, he returned to the City of Oil before the first epoch. Then, he appeared in the dark desolate plains with a lantern that emitted a faint yellow glow. His right hand extended forward and successfully pulled out a projection of the Staff of the Stars. This method could effectively increase the success rate of summoning the Staff of the Stars, but it would clearly reduce the might of this Grade 0 sealed artifact. After all, he was summoning a historical projection of a historical projection. Of course, as it was a race against time, making such a choice was very easy. Klein didn't enter the fog of history again. He reached out to grab his shoulder, and he used dream divination to outline the feedback he received from using Sapphira Castle to reverse corrupt the dark demonic wolf. In the dark, unlit hall in the ancient castle, the mountain-like demonic wolf stood up. Quickly filling in the details, Klein slightly adjusted the details according to the scene of his frozen target. On the black staff, the corresponding gems lit up. In his mind, the scene that resembled an oil painting suddenly swelled up, interweaving with reality, making it impossible to separate from each other. He descended into that ancient castle's dark hall, landing in front of dark demonic wolf Kotor, who had just raised his body with his 8 legs. He had finally officially met the god of wishes that had been living since the second epoch. Without any hesitation, Klein took the opportunity of the dark demonic wolf having just escaped the influence of the ancient wall clock. As he dispelled the historical void projection, he took out an iron cigar case from his pocket and opened it. Inside the cigar case, there was a lone gold coin. Its surface flashed, reflecting Rionette Tynker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress and holding 4 blonde red-eyed heads.
One of the preparations Klein made was to use the method that he had used to bring around Admiral of Blood Seigneur. This allowed him to bring Miss Messenger to the forsaken land of the gods.
Rionette Tinker was no doubt a wraith. Furthermore, she was an even more powerful wraith. She could also possess the smooth surface of a gold coin. In addition, she was a spirit world creature and was intrinsically a spirit. She could enter the world above the grey fog and descend upon the forsaken land of the gods just like Justice Audrey. Based on this condition, in order to not expose the secret within Sapphira Castle and not expose the fool's true identity, he first made Miss Messenger possess the gold coin before using the iron cigar case to seal it. Then, he sacrificed the item to the grey fog before bringing it to the forsaken land of the gods through a bestowment ritual. Of course, the prerequisite for these actions was that Klein had the level and strength of a Sequence 2 angel in Sapphira Castle. Even if something went wrong with Rionette Tinker, he could still handle it. As for Rionette Tinker, she happily agreed to this matter because Gehrman Sparrow had just helped her retrieve a portion of her body. Silently, Miss Messenger left the gold coin and occupied the pitch-black pupil of the dark demonic wolf's eyes. Wraith's possession. Chapter 1244 Wish. Just as Rionette Tinker's figure appeared in dark demonic wolf Coter's pupils, she left the window to the heart and began expanding back to her original size. This meant that her wraith's possession attempt had failed. The dark demonic wolf's body rapidly shrunk and thinned as he madly absorbed the light around him, becoming a translucent black velvet curtain. This was an item that Klein had seen via dream divination. It was ejected from the grayish-white fog and had landed in the hands of the dark demonic wolf. It was suspected to contain the Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries beyond or characteristic of the seer pathway. At this moment, dark demonic wolf Coter had borrowed some of the powers of the curtain to dodge Rionette Tinker's wraith's possession at the critical moment via some unknown means, effectively avoiding the subsequent series of control. The curtain was stowed away after he used it, allowing the dark demonic wolf with his dark, short fur to appear in a spot that was originally empty. Rionette Tinker wasn't surprised by the failure. Taking advantage of this opportunity, a golden-haired, red-eyed head in her hand spat out a rectangular, diamond-like charm. The other three heads used ancient Hermes, Jotun, and Elvish to say a word. Yesterday. The rectangular diamond-like charm was instantly engulfed in transparent flames as it fused with the void. Rionette Tinker's body swelled as the four blonde red-eyed heads flew up and landed on her empty neck, stacked upon one another. In the blink of an eye, Miss Messenger had transformed into a huge doll that could almost break through the dark demonic wolf's castle. She was wearing a black gothic dress with countless mysterious symbols and sinister vines. Her eyes were blood red and she exuded an aura that no human should possess. Dark demonic wolf Coter didn't attempt to stop Rionette Tinker from borrowing strength from her past, nor did he immediately show his complete mythical creature form. With 8 feet on the ground, he raised his neck and let out a roar. This roar seemed to be of a higher level, containing words similar to Jotun. It made the curtain float up and instantly expand, blanketing the ancient castle from top to bottom. The curtain quickly turned transparent and fused with the building. It was as though it had never appeared or had any effect on it. However, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that this place was already isolated from the outside world. If he wanted to leave, he had to first break the invisible barrier. In other words, that curtain made the dark demonic wolf's castle become an independent kingdom. This was the embryonic form of a divine kingdom. Klein, who had just failed and planned on continuing to summon angels to help him, had a spark of inspiration. He instantly changed his mind, reaching into the void and dragging out another hymn. It was Gehrman Sparrow, one who was holding a historical projection of the Staff of the Stars. Right on the heels of that, Klein controlled his historical projection to turn him into his marionette and transfer some worms of spirit over. While he was busy with these matters, Rionette Tinker had already recovered to her peak condition. Her bright red eyes reflected the 8-legged demonic wolf. With a faint flash, the dark demonic wolf turned into a white goat. However, outside the dark hall, a giant holding a broom suddenly trembled and transformed into a demonic wolf with a tuft of gray hair on its forehead. At the moment when the curse was cast on him, a miracle invoker, Heap had swapped places with his marionette. Heap opened his mouth once again and let out a roar. This roar also contained words that mostly resembled the source of Jotun, describing a beautiful wish. I wish for all godhood here to dissipate. In the next second, as the god of wishes, the dark demonic wolf granted his wish. Klein immediately felt his godhood being repressed. The beyonder powers that stemmed from Scholar of Yore and Bizarro Sorcerer could no longer be used. Fortunately, the historical projection was maintained with spirituality. As long as the summoning was successful, it wouldn't be dispelled by the dark demonic wolf's wish. Similarly, as Klein had already turned his historical projection into a marionette and transferred a number of worms of spirit over, he could still swap locations with his projection. Apart from him, Rionette Tinker and Dark Demonic Wolf were also affected by the wish that had been granted. Their beyonder powers above Sequence 5 had vanished into thin air, making it difficult to use them. Of course, be it the demonic wolf marionette that had turned into a goat, or the gigantic doll-like Rionette Tinker, there was no change in their form. What existed was reasonable, so it couldn't be eliminated by the power of wishes. After making this wish, the dark demonic wolf arched his back and bent his body slightly. It looked like he was about to engage in a battle with Klein and Rionette Tinker. At that moment, his mountain-like body was about the size of the castle-like doll. He looked down coldly at Klein, capable of crushing him with a single swipe of his claw. In addition, the castle had many marionettes rushing over. They consisted of giants, elves, vampires, humans, and deformed monsters. Only a number of them were at Sequence 5, but now, they had Koter's worms of spirit in their bodies. In other words, in this special environment, all of them were at Sequence 5. After the dissipation of godhood, in this independent kingdom, Dark Demonic Wolf Koter's advantage became obvious. More than 100 Sequence 5s were besieging 2 Sequence 5s. Furthermore, the Dark Demonic Wolf was itself a mutant. Even if he couldn't reveal any godhood, his massive size and terrifying strength made him adept at combat. He wasn't on the same level as a weak human like marionettist Klein. At this moment, the body of Rionette Tinker, who was dressed in a black gothic dress that twined with sinister vines, suddenly turned incorporeal. First, she reflected on a floor-to-ceiling window, then it jumped into the pitch-black pupils of the dark demonic wolf. She had once again attempted Wraith's possession. However, Dark Demonic Wolf Koter swapped locations with another marionette in a timely fashion, preventing Rionette Tinker from successfully possessing his body. Rionette Tinker wasn't discouraged as she continued using mediums such as glass windows, chandeliers, and eyeballs to jump through the different marionettes in pursuit of the real Dark Demonic Wolf. As for the Dark Demonic Wolf, he relied on his numerous marionettes, and had the advantage of copious numbers of worms of spirit. He swapped between different marionettes without any pause to avoid being forcibly possessed by the ancient bane. Amidst the two angels' silent conflict, a large number of the Dark Demonic Wolf's marionettes had surrounded the two Kleins. Beyonder powers like a vampire's abyss shackles, a giant's hurricane of light, an elf's wind binding, and a human's psychic piercing and holy light summoning inundated their targets. They controlled, weakened, attacked, and purified Klein, acting with great rapport. Klein was only able to dodge a portion of the attacks before being drowned by the attacks. Plasma exploded as the light blasted out. Klein's staff of the stars-holding figure quickly outlined itself to the side. At that critical moment, he had exchanged spots with his marionette in time. He imagined his traveling powers and had used the staff of the stars to complete the teleportation. In this special scenario, this was essentially a release of recorded powers. After dodging this round of attacks, Klein discovered that a marionette was controlling his spirit body threads before he could catch his breath. At the same time, a human marionette reached out his right hand under the influence of the Dark Demonic Wolf and aimed at the miracle invoker's actual body. In the next second, the Dark Demonic Wolf and another marionette switched positions. As for the marionette, it was possessed by Rionette Tinker. This way, the human marionette's right hand was targeted at Rionette Tinker. The marionette's palm clenched tightly as his wrist spun half a circle, stealing away the target's subsequent thoughts. Right on the heels of that, he jumped and pounced on an ally. Rionette Tinker was momentarily rooted to the ground. When the Dark Demonic Wolf saw this, he immediately got several marionettes to spread open their arms and summon pure pillars of cleansing flames to surround them. In the holy light, Wraith Rionette Tinker's body first began to melt. Following that, using mirror jump, she moved to a glass window situated high above the castle to avoid the subsequent purification. In just a few seconds, Sheev and Klein inevitably fell into a perilous situation. The restricted environment, being on his home ground, and his trait as the god of wishes had magnified Dark Demonic Wolf Koter advantage to the extreme.
If it were any other scholar of yore, there was only one problem he needed to consider: how to rely on Rionette Tinker to escape, but Klein had his trump card. Just as he pulled back his spirit body threads, he didn't hesitate to stir the powers of Sapphira Castle. This trait of his wasn't suppressed by the dark demonic wolf's wish. This was something even the forsaken land of the gods couldn't screen. In midair, grayish-white fog appeared. The ancient palace above the spirit world appeared faint. Its appearance brought with it slight tremors. A certain power followed the connection and shook the demonic wolf's castle, causing the translucent black velvet curtain to jolt out of place a little, allowing the independent kingdom to intersect with reality. Seizing this opportunity, Klein opened his mouth and shouted out a name in Jotun. Leodoro. Boom, boom, boom. Thousands of thick silver lightning bolts descended from the sky, smiting dark demonic wolf Kotur's castle. The area transformed into a lightning forest that emitted a strong destructive aura. Chapter 1245 Help available even without summoning help. Boom, boom, boom. The bolts of silver lightning that were as thick as an anaconda struck the translucent black velvet curtain. It shook violently as it distorted. Taking advantage of this opening, Rionette Tinker's figure, which was reflected on the castle's glass, jumped back into Klein's pocket and returned to the surface of the gold coin in the iron cigar case. The prepared Klein raised his right arm and calmly aimed the staff of the stars at the floor tiles in the hall. A scene surfaced in his mind. It represented one of the beyonder powers of a druid. The ground beneath his feet instantly softened, turning into a marsh. It made his body sink like it had fallen into a sea. Underground slink. Boom. The translucent black velvet curtain could no longer withstand the cleansing from the lightning storm the moment the marsh solidified. It curled into a ball and fell back into the castle. No longer restricted, the few thousand thick bolts of lightning rained down the ancient castle. A tower collapsed and the hall was left in shambles. One marionette after another burst into ephemeral illusions under the pricking of such a lightning strike. They were instantly charred black and reduced to ashes. When the silver light that illuminated the entire mountain range subsided, dark demonic wolf Kotur's castle was in ruins. Many spots were burning with red flames. Klein immediately emerged from the bottom of a deep pit and saw that the demonic wolf, covered in dark and short fur, had performed the same action. Relying on the 3 druids among his marionettes, he had successfully hidden underground to avoid the lightning bombardment. And at that moment, the independent kingdom created by the curtain had completely disintegrated. However, the dark demonic wolf's wish hadn't completely expired. The return of godhood still needed some time. Without any hesitation, both parties engaged in another intense battle. Kotur allowed the crinkled curtain to fly up and drape him, so as to prevent the wraith's possession. After all, there were only 3 of his marionettes left. Of course, this way, he could no longer swap locations with his marionettes. At the same time, Rionette Tinker left the gold coin in Klein's pocket and floated towards the 8-legged demonic wolf. She had given up on the idea of possession as her arms suddenly swelled. A few strands of gray hair grew from the back of her hand, and her nails became long, sharp and firm. Werewolf transformation. This doll-like baneful entity became a huge werewolf. She kept moving at high speeds, waving her sharp claws as she engaged in an intense battle with the hill-like dark demonic wolf. Amidst the clashing sounds, Klein was attacked by Kotur's 3 remaining marionettes. One of them raised his head and roared, causing brown short hair to tear through his clothes. In an instant, he transformed into a terrifying giant bear that was twice the height of a person. One crouched down, pressing his palms against the ground, while the other raised his right hand and yanked his hair. At that moment, a crimson flame surged out of Klein's clothes, instantly devouring him. His figure appeared in a sea of flames to the side. Then he jumped out, raised his staff, and charged straight at the huge brown bear. And at the spot where he was originally standing, dark green mutated vines pierced through the ground and grew wildly, stirring the remnant flames in the middle. Tap, tap, tap. The huge brown bear didn't back down. With heavy strides, it rushed towards Klein like a high-speed steam locomotive. It spread open its arms, trying to give him a passionate hug that could crush all his bones and squeeze all his chest muscles together. Tap, tap, tap. As his black trench coat flailed to his back, Klein didn't retreat. He was about to collide with the huge brown bear. Suddenly, he kicked his left foot and twisted his waist.
He forcefully jumped up and flew past the brown bear diagonally. Thud. As the two crossed each other, Klein swung his black staff down and ruthlessly struck the brown bear's shoulder. Normally, such an attack wouldn't have been able to hurt the thick hide of the brown bear. However, with the Staff of the Stars, the physical attack would lead to random abnormal changes or strange effects. Of course, under the God of Wishes' suppression, these changes and effects wouldn't exceed that of a sequence 4 beyonder power. Thud. As the sound of the staff strike reverberated, the huge brown bear's shoulder tore open diagonally from its shoulder. The bottom half of its torso teleported more than 10 meters away while the remaining portion remained in place. The brown bear's internal organs and blood gushed to the ground in a rather shocking scene. However, the brown bear wasn't dead yet. Its two halves were squirming as it struggled to stabilize his center of mass and continued attacking. As a marionette, he had long died. Such damage was nothing. At this moment, Klein had already jumped behind the brown bear, his feet stepping on the ground. Another wave of scarlet flame surged out, drowning his figure.
A flame that was about to be extinguished rose up as Klein leaped out and arrived close to the marionette, which had both hands on the ground. With his silk top hat, he ran past the marionette without turning his head as he swung the staff to the side.
Thud. The marionette's body burst into golden flames as his figure instantly vanished. A flame surged into the sky as the marionette jumped down. However, the golden flames didn't extinguish, quickly burning him to ashes. Without even looking over, Klein had already rushed in front of the marionette that was yanking his hair. The marionette immediately threw out the hair in his hand. These strands of hair began to burn as they emitted black gases, sounding alarms to Klein's spirituality senses. Poison! An unknown poison. With a creak, he forcefully stopped using his ability as a clown.
Using the inertia of his body, he extended his black staff.
All sorts of thoughts rapidly reformed in his mind, quickly forming a scene. Before this operation, Klein had requested Miss Justice's help to hypnotize him. It made his brain unable to form scenes when he subconsciously thought of one.
There would only be a single thought resonating in his mind, and he had to take the initiative to control it to construct the scene.
This allowed him to use the Staff of the Stars for a long time without being affected by the negative effects.
As for the flaws of thinking in such a manner, Klein felt that it was still acceptable under predetermined conditions.
Without a sound, the gems embedded in the Staff of the Stars lit up. A pure white and holy pillar of light descended from the sky, enveloping the black gas and the corresponding marionette. The poison quickly melted under the sun's burning. It was the same with the marionette.
With a remnant glow still in his eyes, Klein instinctively turned around and aimed his staff at the brown bear that was split into two.
Silver lightning flashed spontaneously before the separated brown bear's body finally collapsed, unable to get up again. In just a few seconds, Klein had finished off the remaining marionettes of the dark demonic wolf. After Sapphira Castle's anomaly, be it him or the God of Wishes, time became abnormally precious. No one was willing to stall for time, because it wouldn't be long before high-level existences like the true creator and angel of time Amon in the forsaken land of the gods descended. Upon seeing this, dark demonic wolf Kotor trembled violently and flung out the translucent velvet curtain. The curtain first vanished into thin air before it suddenly appeared behind Klein.
Just as his spirituality was about to send a warning, it covered him and wrapped him within it.
Klein's vision immediately darkened as he felt his thoughts turn sluggish. His spirit body threads were being inoculated onto the curtain, one thread at a time. He attempted using Flaming Jump, softening his bones, and using the Staff of the Stars, but he was unable to succeed in such an abnormal state. The black velvet curtain became tighter and tighter, revealing the corresponding marks of his eyes, nose and mouth, as though it was squeezing out a brand new person. Rionette Tinker immediately jumped and appeared on the translucent curtain, purging it from Klein's body and teleporting elsewhere. The dark demonic wolf seized the opportunity and raised his neck, letting out a roar. The curtain stood up, as if it had become a cloak draped over an invisible person's body. A terrifying suction force was born, causing the spirit body threads of Rionette Tinker and Klein to uncontrollably float over. If they didn't have the corresponding Beyonder powers, their spirit body threads would have merged into the cloak in just 3 to 4 seconds, while they would become its marionettes. Fortunately, Klein was a marionettist himself. He immediately focused his attention and controlled his and Miss Messenger's spirit body threads. He followed the method that he learned from Zeratul, allowing them to circle around him and return to their original positions, forming loops. Roar! The dark demonic wolf spat out a gas ball, sending it flying towards Klein like a cannonball. As he was focused on controlling his and Miss Messenger's spirit body threads, Klein could barely duck. Just as he was about to be struck, Rionette Tynker floated over and stood in front of him. Boom! Rionette Tynker's blonde hair scattered as the evil vines wrapped around her body broke apart. The dark demonic wolf's follow-up actions were one smooth continuous series of actions. Taking advantage of the moment when the curtain was desperately pulling at its target's spirit body threads, he launched repeated attacks on Klein, forcing Rionette Tynker to block them. It caused the tough ancient Bane to tremble under the attack of his claws, air blobs, and flaming attacks. More and more wounds appeared, making it look like Sheep could not last any longer. At this critical moment, as Klein controlled the spirit body threads to resist the attraction of the curtain, he reached into his pocket and took out another iron cigar case. The seal was removed and the box was opened. Inside, there was also a gold coin lying quietly. There was also a wraith on the surface of the gold coin. This was a blurry female wraith, a true undying creature, and not a wraith from the mutant pathway. It was the strongest trump card that Klein had prepared. Previously, because he was inside the isolated kingdom that wasn't connected to the outside world, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to obtain the desired effect. Only when the curtain targeted him and Miss Messenger did he feel that the opportunity was here. As the box was opened, the wraith suddenly jumped onto the surface of a glass fragment. On it were nearly illusory black tubes that extended into infinity, connecting to the unknown. This was the symbol of artificial death. And artificial death was equivalent to the Evernight Goddess. This trump card of his was the reenactment of the time when the Evernight Goddess had used God of Glory Bladdle's corpse to foil Amon's attempt to snatch Sapphira Castle. For this, he deliberately found a wraith-like monster in the forsaken land of the gods and imprisoned it, placing it together with the artificial death project's white feathers he summoned from the fog of history. Through his repeated experiments and prayers during his specific trips to Backlund, this wraith had finally established a certain connection with artificial death, allowing the Evernight Goddess to use this opportunity to exert a rather low level of influence. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.